Good morning and welcome to the panel, Are We Out of the Woods? The New Policy Mix for Europe. I am Giancarlo Corsetti. I'm a professor of economics, joint professor at the economic department at the Robert Schuman Center here at the UI. And I will be moderating this panel together with Giorgia Giovannetti, professor of economics and vice dean at the University of Florence of Firenze. We are lucky to have an extremely qualified panel, extremely qualified panelist, addressing a seemingly rhetorical question. Are we out of the woods? The answer is clearly no, but we'll challenge the panelists to help us understand in two dimensions of the question. The first one is, what kind of woods are we in? So what are the priorities, the threats, the opportunities, the constraints? Now, to know whether we are close to the edge, we need to know the woods. And the second question, even more important, what are the instruments and the policies that may help us making our way out of the woods? This is an important question because past crisis has taught us that we need a multiplicity of instruments and policies, and we better make sure that these policies and instruments are consistent with each other. The policy mix is what is actually important. And we'll discuss these topics taking a European perspective, but clearly we cannot abstract from global considerations. We'll discuss these topics as economists, but clearly there is much, much more than economics in it, because, first of all, to have a policy mix, we need to coordinate and collaborate across borders. And second, if I may say, the panel evokes a little bit the fable of the Little Red Riding Hood, except that now we are in the woods with 28 of Little Red Riding Hoods, 28 and counting, and there clearly may be more than one big bad wolf out there. So trying to understand what to do, whether we can get out together or one by one, what are the opportunities and the challenges is very important. So we'll discuss this with Sylvain Johansson is one of the directors of the McKinsey Global Institute and advisor to the European financial institutions for the past 20 years. Next to me, Pierre Olivier Gourinchas, professor at Berkeley, now the chief economist at the Economic Council and director of research in the IMF, currently on leave from Berkeley. Jeromin Zettelmeyer, director of Bruegel, is also worked for the IMF, the German Minister of Economic Affairs. He has a very distinguished policy record as a policy researcher and economist. And live on the screen, Laurence Boone, former Secretary of State for European Affairs, and with also a distinguished career as an economist, economic counselor to the Prime Minister Hollande, at the CPE and the OECD. So we'll start with an introduction by Laurence. I'll give you the floor. And we'll have 2 or 3 rounds and make sure that we'll have enough time for questions from the audience.
So first, thank you. Thank you both for the invitation and for allowing me to be online. I'm aware this is not perfect, but it will force me to go straight to the point. And Giancarlo has started answering the question, which is, we are not out of the wood. And what I would like to share with you now is 3 things that we need to do to get out of the wood. So explanation and things that we need to do. The first one, I think, is that we need a better enlargement process for all the accession countries, and including Ukraine. And that's obviously about economic policies, defense policy, and security. The second is that we need to strengthen our economic doctrine for the single market. And this is obviously about deepening the single market, energy, telecom, finance, which were not in the single market original version. But it's also about better protecting the single market with reciprocity and inward investment control. And it's also about stronger economic security and strategic trade. And the third point I will make is that for these 2 things to happen in an efficient way, we need financing. And what I'd like to convince you of is that it's an illusion to think that the EU can be driven by norms only. Everywhere in the world, in each country, each government, priorities are defined by the amount of investment that we put into them. And in the case of the EU, when I talk about financing, I mean both fiscal policy, but also how at the EU level, but also how each member state is actually ready to cooperate with other member states. So let me, get briefly into each of these points. So the first thing is to be a real geopolitical power in a world which is obviously overwhelmed by Russian aggression, among other aggression, is that we need to put our act together when it comes to support for Ukraine. As an example, the war has been going on for 2 years, and we still see some EU countries in the need of begging on behalf of the entire EU to get ammunition. That means we haven't put our act together in terms of industrial production of defense equipment. And this is putting Ukraine at risk. Yet, it's not only a war against Ukraine that Russia is leading, as we know, it's also a war against our model, about the democracy of our model, the values, and the economy of our model. Because we have a real war in Ukraine, but we have a hybrid war against the EU. And this hybrid war takes the form and the shape of division and destabilization. And for this, we will also need to put a better industrial policy and better defense and security policy. So we will need support for Ukraine, we need support to fight the hybrid war, and we will also need to reconstruct Ukraine with a true European Marshall Plan, like what the US had done with the EU. And this support for Ukraine has to come for the EU, because the reason we're doing it is to anchor it in the EU to guarantee our security. Okay, so if we do that, one thing we have to change about enlargement is that it has to focus on the rule of law, on the single market acquis, but we also have to think better about defense and security criteria. We know those countries will not be in NATO soon, but if we are doing this enlargement to strengthen our geopolitical position, we need them to participate in the defense and security of the EU. So those criteria should be included as well into the EU process of enlargement. So that's the first point I want to make, is that we need to move into a policy framework of war economy with the defense and security of ourselves and the border countries. And if we want to do that, then we will obviously have to review the way we work, so the governance of the EU. And it will be the theme of the other point as well, to unlock the capacity of the EU to act. We need to put funding where our priorities are. And I'll come back to this at the end. Okay, so that's the first point, geopolitical power. What does that mean? The second is, to be a geopolitical power, we need to be a real economic power. And we have the potential to do so. I always start my speeches in the US by saying that, we're the largest economy in the world, with 440 million people, with a GDP per head of 25,000 euros. We're the world's largest trading bloc. We have 80 trading partners. The US has 20. We also are the first direction for inward investment, and we're the first region to do outward investment. Okay, and that's because the EU has embraced globalization like no other region in the world has done. Okay, this has brought us huge benefits, but it has also not been without mistakes. We have become too dependent on unfriendly countries for energy and for strategic goods. And countries, we've seen that with Russia, do not hesitate to weaponize those dependencies. We have believed that trade would be enough to diffuse our values like democracy, but we're paying today a quite high price to see that those values are not universal. And the dependencies have made us vulnerable, and more than anything, we're losing competitiveness. So what do we need to do? So I'm not going to get at length in there. I can see Giancarlo started sweating, but Enrico Letta's report has shown, and Mario Draghi's work will explain in details what we have to do about this. I'll just mention 3 things. The first is energy. We cannot be competitive without a reliable supply of energy at a low price. And I think it's more costly. The energy prices are much higher than in the US, 2 to 3 times higher, or China. Even so, we've made a lot of progress in the transition. So we need to tackle this with more interconnection and unifying the energy market across the EU. And we also need consumers to benefit faster from this energy transition and lower prices. Otherwise, either they are unhappy, which is not good for the vote that they have, or firms can also leave when they're very energy incentive. So first thing is energy for being an economic power. The second is to have a competitive industry. And I think we've been increasing investment in many areas like health or semiconductor, but we need to go much faster, and we need to go bigger, and we need to go more united. Because what we have done at the moment is to lower the barrier for state aid, and that is leading to fragmentation. So what that means is if we want to be a real competitive region, we have to cooperate and coordinate a lot more when it comes to industrial policy. And that's my second sub-point. And the third one I want to make about economics, it's also about strategic trade and economic security. We, being this very largest economy of the world, we can demand greater reciprocity from our partner. We can also review inward investment threshold, and we can consider coordination mechanism for export control. And on all this, I won't go much further because I think Jeromin has a lot to say about it. But what I want to say is we need to align our commercial and trade policy without foreign policy. We need to align our industrial policy and the resources we need for this in terms of critical raw materials with our foreign policy. And that's a very radical change compared with what we've been doing with trade policy for the past 70 years. So that's the second pillar: economic power, energy, industrial policy, strategic trade, and investment policy. These 2 things I've been briefly describing, the enlargement and the amended method of enlargement with the reconstruction of Ukraine and the fight against hybrid war on the one hand, being much more competitive by being much more coordinating and cooperating on investment and on industrial policy. That will mean that we need to change the way that we conduct our EU budget. If we believe that the funding or the money we put behind the priority is a reflection of the true importance voice of our priority, then we're completely at odds with what I've just been describing. Because at the moment, we have an EU budget that is 1/3 agriculture policy, 1/3 cohesion policy, and the rest of it for functioning and other policies. So it's not at all what I've just been discussing. We had a chance last summer to actually overhaul this EU budgetary capacity, but we just amended the national fiscal policies. And what I would like to offer here is that we need to review this framework by being somewhat tighter and more restrictive on national fiscal policy, but allowing a larger EU budget for our common policies, for energy, for industrial policy. And that would be a radical change. And the other thing is we have been talking a lot about capital market union. And I finish with that. It's a bad word. People hate capital, they hate markets, and they don't like union. We need to talk about this savings and investment union, and we need to make it move so that the savings of the people go and fund the industry of tomorrow into the EU. So to sum up, I think that we need to put our finances behind our priorities, and our priorities have shifted dramatically with respect to the last 70 years. Thank you.
Thank you, Laurence.
Thank you very much, Laurence. You have mentioned issues which are very, very important, and the way that we are going to address now in the panel, and of course you are most than welcome to say something during the discussion, is going to be around three main themes, which are basically addressing your question on the short term, medium term, and long term. So you have different type of implication. You mentioned enlargement, competitiveness, coordination. We cannot just have one period of time. Now, so let's start with the immediate concern. We are 2 years after the inflation hike, and we thought that the stabilization effort will be actually over. Have we actually tamed inflation? What are the costs that we had in taming inflation? How should economic policy should rebalance? The first person I will ask to discuss this is Pierre Olivier, so I'll give you the word first, please.
Well, thank you very much. Let me say a few things, and I will take it all the way to the other extreme from Laurence's remarks. So I will start from the short term and the medium term. So let me make 3 points. So first, on the inflation fight. So this was certainly one of the woods we were in, going back to Giancarlo, but maybe at this point, in a number of countries, it's become more of a shrubbery. I mean, we're on our way to bring inflation back to target. I think the news is pretty good, but there are still some risks, and the risks are more balanced. But there are risks both on the upside and on the downside. And let me flesh that out a little bit. On the upside, certainly one of the things that we would be concerned about is what might be happening to energy and commodity prices if there are escalation of geopolitical tensions, in particular coming from the Middle East, or disruption in shipping, as we've seen some of that since October of last year and the beginning of this year. And so we've run some scenarios at the IMF in the research department, and so far the effects are relatively contained. But if you had a significant increase in oil prices, a significant increase in shipping costs, something of the order of 10% for oil price for 24 and 25, something like 150%, sounds like a big number, but it's actually small compared to what we had around the time of COVID for shipping costs. Then you would have increases in inflation, for instance, in the euro area, of about 70 basis points in 2024. So that's not negligible. It will certainly derail some of the disinflation process. But there are risks also on the downside for inflation. I think that's important, especially in the context of the euro area. I think the euro area is certainly one region where I would be more concerned about the risks to the downside. Now, some of them are coming from external factors. You can think, for instance, of the weakness in China. What we are seeing with the weakness in China is deflation in export prices. And deflation in export prices means that import prices in Europe are coming down, and that would contribute to bring inflation down faster. Now, in the current context, that's creating some problems as well. There are all this talk about overcapacity, and maybe there shouldn't be as much deflation in export prices coming from China. But at least the force that is coming from weaker Chinese growth is pushing towards lower inflation. So overall, I think there is a sense in which the risks are balanced, but the trajectory is heading back in the right direction. Now, the second point is that also a short-term point is most countries, including euro area countries, European Union countries, are now either withdrawing measures that were put in place after COVID or after the energy crisis, or embarking on further fiscal consolidation. And that is absolutely needed. There is a need to rebuild buffers after a crisis like we've seen in the last 4 or 5 years. One of the big lessons actually from the last 4 years is the amount of fiscal buffers you had, the fiscal space you had really determined how much you could do in protecting households and businesses. And so there is a need to rebuild some of that. It needs to be done, but it needs to be done gradually, carefully, in a way that doesn't derail the burgeoning growth or rebound in economic activity that we are seeing. One has to be careful, and that calls for calibration of monetary and fiscal policy, maybe a little bit more than we think about. Now, the last point I want to make in this, say, first round of opening remarks is more on the medium term. And that's also a point about the fiscal landscape. And here I think there's a lot of discussion in thinking about what things might look like, let's say 5 years out, that focuses on where the natural rate is headed. And the natural rate is the rate at which saving and investment sort of equilibrate, at which it's going to be equilibrium real rate, if you want, in the economy. And we know it's been coming down a lot, and there's a lot of discussion about whether it's going to remain low or it's going to increase back to levels we had seen, let's say, 20 years ago. Now, if it increases back, it could be bad news for fiscal dynamics because it would increase the cost of rolling over debt. But the point I want to make is that even if the natural rate remains low, and there are good reasons to think it might well remain low, productivity growth is still very weak, demographic forces are still pushing, and aging of population are still increasing savings and pushing down equilibrium interest rates, that doesn't mean that government funding costs are going to remain low. There is a number of scenarios where what we would see is the term premium would go back to, let's say, more historical levels, what we've seen before 2010, 2011. And that means that funding costs, say the 10-year government yields, could very well increase maybe more permanently, even if natural rates remain very low. They've been, the spread has been very, very compressed in the last 10 years. And that is something that one has to be concerned about. Again, this is something that's going to erode fiscal space, reduce the R minus G advantage, if you want, that people like Olivier Blanchard have been talking about. So it's certainly something that is also a concern and means that there's even more necessity to address and put public debt dynamics on a sustainable path. I have some things to say about productivity and long-term growth, but I'll reserve them for later in the panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Do you want to add anything on this short run, Sylvain?
No, not going to go against
the IMF.
Yeah, no, for sure. I have strong views on the medium term. I think it's a lot about all the ripple effects, right? As we say, there's still lots of risk out there around energy, around wage growth, around tight labor markets, around asset reevaluations and how that will all play out. We do see, though, that the stickiness of consumer inflation is not the same in the US as in Europe currently, and so these ripple effects play currently a bit differently. But more comments when we go to the medium term.
Of course. What about you, Jeromin?
Nothing to
Nothing. Okay. So Giancarlo, you may want to...
So no, I'm just like, maybe I go back to Sylvain in this medium term. I mean, if you look at the medium term, there is embarrassment of riches. You can think of climate, you can think of security, you can think of energy. But also, if you look at where we stand now, we have a picture for Europe where there is a demographic problem, a technology gap problem, and the legacy of the past effort to stabilize the economy, which is high private and public debt. How would you think about these medium-term issues from the perspective of McKinsey that has always been providing fantastic looking ahead analysis?
So consumer inflation is under control, probably, right? But there's one inflation that is still very much with us in Europe, is still very much with us, and that's the balance sheet inflation. And maybe we are out of the woods, one of the woods, when we get out of this and we deleverage our balance sheet. And so I will touch on three things, right? How big is that balance sheet inflation that is still very much here? How do we get out of it, or what are the paths from here? Any early signs that we see on this? I think the last 20 years, we've seen an expansion of the global balance sheet, and way above GDP growth, right? And if we think global net worth in the most simple term, assets minus liabilities, it's gone at the global level, 2000 from 160 trillion to now 2022, 630 trillion. That was back then 4.8 times GDP, and now is 6.2 times GDP. And so we've basically created 160 trillion of paper wealth. In times of cheap money, or sometimes almost free money, that was primarily driven by debt growth, and of course asset revaluation above inflation. And it came at the same time as the investment as a share of GDP has gone down. We used to be also, back 20 years ago, 6-8% of GDP, and that was halved after the global financial crisis. So we have that a bit ballooned or inflated balance sheet, and one could say it might need to mean reverse. And recent interest rate rises that we've seen have, of course, shown more prudence on debt, have seen some leveling off on assets. So maybe 2021 was peak balance sheet, maybe not. So where do we go from there? One way is to keep growing it, right? Secular stagnation, savings glut, negative real interest rate, and balance sheet inflation continues. Maybe not the ideal scenario, but that might be possible. Another one is higher for longer. Lots of investments in decarbonization, in security, therefore sustain high inflation, and we inflate our way out of this balance sheet, of this oversized balance sheet. We could have productivity acceleration, which means all these investments work, productivity improves, and we basically outgrow the balance sheet. That would be a really good outcome. And of course, we could have a bit more brutal deleveraging if we have very tight fiscal monetary policy, still inflation, and we may have asset value correction and a lost decade or a version of it. And so these are different ways to evolve from the current inflated balance sheet. If we look at early signs, we see differences between the regions, but it's too early to tell. Of course, it seems the US investment is growing, productivity growth is there, so they might be on that productivity acceleration out of the inflated balance sheet. It's a bit more worrying for Europe currently. We need investment. I think that's the theme. We need capex, we need technology, we need R&D to get that ultimately productivity growth. And the question, as mentioned by my colleague Jan on panel yesterday, etc., is do we have the condition, and Laurence earlier, do we have the condition, maybe a 28th regime, to have the size and the scale for these investments to take place?
I guess I need to bring you in, Jeromin or Pierre Olivier, on this.
Yeah, I mean...
Sorry, Laurence?
Yeah, perhaps. Well, can I rebound on this? I have a question, actually, for both Pierre Olivier and Sylvain, but I'm sure that Jeromin can help with it as well. So we have trillions of savings that are not being channeled into long-term investment in Europe. And they're not being channeled partly because of the fragmentation of the market. But the question for me is, imagine that the 25 EU countries that do not have really pension funds, so if I take out Sweden and a couple of others, decide to have some tomorrow. And it's a European pension fund, so it's got the same regulation across countries. That's releasing trillions of euros. What is first the impact of the natural rates that Pierre Olivier was highlighting as something which could go up quite significantly, because we're talking about long-term savings for long-term investment. And if we do that in robots, like Japan has been doing for the past decades, does that solve the productivity issue that Sylvain was talking about? So in other words, I think we have the keys to unlock this situation, but I would like the experts, Jeromin, Pierre Olivier, and Sylvain, to tell me whether this is true.
So I don't have the answers. I want to hear the answer, particularly from Pierre Olivier. But I wanted to speak because I had another question. So I'm wondering whether we can sort of take all the questions and then let those that have already spoken at length answer. So my first question is, I guess, to both of you, is this Sylvain's idea that we need to, deflate balance sheet the same thing as what you were saying, Pierre Olivier, which is about rebuilding buffers, or is there something else? Because I understand the need to rebuild buffers, but beyond that, I'm not completely sure I understand the need to reduce balance sheet inflation. I basically don't understand what balance sheet inflation means, other than balance sheets have gone up a lot, and that may not be desirable. Why is it not desirable? So, one story is we want, large balance sheets reflect a lot of leverage. Leverage is risky. we want to reduce these risks because they're future shocks, and that seems to match with the buffers story. Is that what it is? And then I have a specific question about the ECB's balance sheet. So if we think of the need to, in a sense, prepare. If we take the analogy between the public sector balance sheet, the government balance sheet, and the need to rebuild buffers there, and the ECB's balance sheet, the main argument, I think, why the ECB should reduce its balance sheet is to prepare for the next QE. So, you know, we want to drive it down so we can build it back up if necessary. That's exactly the same argument for why we want public debt to fall, so we have more borrowing space in the future. But there's another way of preparing for, in a sense, the next QE, which is that rather than reducing the size of the balance sheet by selling bonds, by doing quantitative tightening, it might be, and I noticed Marcello Messori is in the room, it might be to issue ECB paper. So that would maintain the overall size of the balance sheet unchanged, but it would change the composition of liabilities, essentially, with a much bigger share of ECB bonds. And then the idea is that maybe in a future quantitative easing episode, it might be easier, faster, politically less difficult for the ECB to buy back its own bonds than to go through another round of public sector bond purchases. So maybe someone can comment on that idea.
Well, let me say a few things quickly. So first, on balance sheet inflation, I think a big part of the story, at least in the last few years, the inflation process was in fact re-equilibrating the balance sheets. We had during COVID let me leave aside the energy crisis, but what we had injection of massive liquidity, fiscal support, monetary support, basically so that people wouldn't go out and produce and consume. They were told to stay home. So that's very much like a war economy. So in a war economy, you also provide support to households, but they're not producing, they're on the trenches. And of course, when the economy reopens, when the war ends, people have liquidity, they want to consume, the goods are not there. What do you have? You have a reset of the price level. And the reset of the price level compresses the private sector balance sheet, and it compresses the public sector balance sheet, and that brings back things into equilibrium. And to a large extent, this is, I think, what we are seeing. Now, you have to control, make sure there is no second round effect, you don't de-anchor inflation, but by and large, this is the consequence. On top of that, you have the energy crisis in Europe and in other parts of the world, but that's kind of a separate shock that came on top of the first one. So I'm not too worried about the balance sheet inflation per se, I would say. On the ECB balance sheet, to address Jeromin's second question, I think there the worry is that central banks are very, very nervous about what happens, and they've seen that right now, when interest rates rise rapidly and all of a sudden they have to report losses on the asset side of their balance sheet. And I don't think necessarily, unless they match the duration, but then it kind of becomes a little bit tricky to think about what it would do in terms of stimulus, that these valuation losses would go away if somehow you have them issuing bonds rather than increasing just liquidity. So I think that's kind of the nervousness they have. And in the current environment, I think a number of central banks are trying to come to a region where there might be less of a risk. Now, on Laurence's point about saving and investment, I think this is right, but if I want to push the argument a little bit further, the worry I have with this is that it sounds as if the message is, okay, we have a current account surplus as a whole, we have savings exceeding investment. Why don't we make sure that those savings go and fund investment domestically? Now, unless somehow you close the system, that's not going to happen. I mean, so unless you go to something that is more financial repression, that sort of locks the savings inside, I don't exactly see how you make that happen unless you address the drivers, the fundamental drivers of the weakness of investment relative to savings. Now, some of it is maybe due to frictions, the lack of a capital market union. I agree with Laurence, it's a terrible name, let's find another name. But I think this is where you can make progress. I'm not exactly sure that a pension vehicle, unless you give it a mandate that will lock it in, etc., that's a form of financial repression as well. So anyway, that's my quick reaction.
You want to just have a last word on
Yeah. Long, when in the very short-term balance sheet, inflation is per se, fair enough, not an issue, but in long-term series, when it detaches too much from GDP, at some point that's leverage. And leverage is always great as long as it's great, right?
Yes.
And so you have more freedom and you have less brutality when you don't have too much leverage. And that's why in the long run, this could be worrying. Therefore, we need investment, we need productivity growth, and how do we create the conditions? The example of the pension funds or others could be one, but we want to see it across Europe.
If I just want to close, there is an issue not only on the size, but also the composition of the balance sheet, both on the asset side and the liability side. Something that is not well known, corporate leverage is actually shrinking. So what we talk about leverage, we talk about public sector and households. Corporate leverage in Europe across industry, across borders, across firm size is going down kind of heavily from the 2008 to today, which brings back the last, the last part, which is at the end of the day, the balance sheet is an instrument for investment, productivity, investment in non-tangibles. So there is this issue that firms are moving ahead of the old style of firm, going to the bank. There is something much more there. So maybe I'll pass to Giorgia the last bit.
But especially we have to ask a question to Jeromin, who has been asking questions. He substituted us rather than answering the question. So I think now you have to answer a question. Let's go back to the introduction, to what Laurence was saying. And one thing that she mentioned was the economic security. What are the dimensions, like Giancarlo was sort of suggesting, of European economic security, which are relevant for the policy design? You have been speaking, for instance, about fragmentation of production in some of your papers, or defragmentation, global value chain, de-risking the import or export trade-related issues. So I would like you to elaborate a little on this.
Right. So the first point I want to make is to really agree with Laurence that, in a sense, the most important long-term issue we are facing in the EU right now is the very short-term issue of avoiding Ukraine from being essentially conquered by Russia. And so I think that, if this happens, it would have a huge long-term impact. And so this is clearly the number one issue that should be on the minds of all EU policymakers, and particularly on the minds of the Commission. Now, national security and defense is not my specialty, but as you suggest, we have been thinking about economic security in the context of a project that we did with the CEPR, the Center for Economic Policy Research. We have a report on this, the Paris report too, and what we are trying to do there is essentially getting to grips with our intuition as economists that international integration and trade is fundamentally a good thing, but on the other hand, that it can also bring security risks. And that is a very similar, I think, thought process that has been going on at the IMF as well in parallel. And so the reason why we struggle with this all a bit is that we see trade-offs everywhere. So fundamentally, the idea that we might become overly dependent through trade relationships that can then be exploited by sort of a nefarious foreign power, or simply become harmful through external shocks, is a reflection of international specialization. And of course, international specialization is the very source of the gains from trade. So, this is a truly Janus-phased problem, and we have focused mostly on one phase. We need to focus on the other phase now, but we cannot forget the first. Then we must never forget some of the lessons of the global financial crisis, which were that, yes, external shocks it can be very harmful, but on the other hand, international integration can also be a source for better dealing with domestic shocks, right? So, clearly in the pandemic, in a closed economy, we would have done far worse, right? So trade was important even in an acute situation like this pandemic, because then there, shortages are less likely to occur if you're integrated. The other, of course, casualty, the big one, is international cooperation. So if we close ourselves off, that sends a signal of distrust. But of course, the other thing it does, it lowers the costs of a potential conflict. So international integration does have a preventive effect as far as conflict is concerned. And then finally, particularly in the EU, we have to be worried that a very aggressive policy that is focused on economic security is going to reduce our internal cohesion in the EU because we have different countries with different interests. So these are all the caveats. Now, with all the caveats, I do believe we need to move more into the direction of giving economic security a greater weight. And, you know, the general sense in which I think we need to find a balance, I think, is nicely encapsulated by Ursula von der Leyen's famous phrase about de-risking, not decoupling. Now, the problem with that phrase is it doesn't really tell you what de-risking means. And so the main insight of this report is that I think, conventional interpretation of de-risking, certainly mostly as I perceive the Commission's interpretation, which is that we should focus on import dependencies at the product level and then try to diversify them, or strengthen domestic production through industrial policy in these product categories. This answer really falls short. And it falls short for two different reasons. The first is that import dependencies at the product level are incredibly hard to identify. And so this is shown by one chapter. And the main reason why they're hard to identify is that, you know, they are based on current patterns of trade that may well change very quickly in the event of an external shock. And of course, even if a disruption in trade is not substituted by other production trade relationships. So if we were not, say, able to diversify away from China in the event of a disruption, it is still very unclear how much this actually would hurt the economy, right? So that really depends on the good involved. You know? Can we substitute consumption away from that good? So if we really focus on these import dependency stuff, we may get some things right, but we will miss many things and we may overestimate some of these things. The other major insight from this report is that the short-term impact of a trade decoupling is an order of magnitude bigger than the impact of a slow decoupling. And the reason for this is that the short-term impacts are propagated not just through imports, but through exports, and the export side is very often forgotten in this debate. But it's also that, you know, if we make these transitions slowly, ultimately, the world is big enough to preserve most gains from trade, even if we were to trade far less with one particular partner like China. So what does this all suggest? So it suggests first that, you know, by all means, we should focus on de-risking some import dependencies where we are really sure that it can create a problem. For example, chips. But it also says it's not going to be enough to do that because we will always get this wrong. And so that very strongly pushes you into a more resilience-based strategy that is, in a sense, robust to where the next shock may come from. And that is a very strong and additional argument for the single market, right? So the single market is the one area where there's no trade-off between security and growth. It also pushes you towards an approach that focuses more on deterrence, because again, deterrence can help you against any sort of harmful action. And in this point, the Commission actually has done rather well. So they have done a very powerful anti-coercion instrument that can help in a broad sense. And then finally, we do have to focus more on the export and the FDI side. And then the question is, how do we do that? Should we encourage broad-based de-risking from China? Should we just lower trade integration and particularly export dependency? So that's an important question. Or should we tell those exporters, look, you can still do what you want, but you know, take a prudential approach, make sure you have the buffers internally in case something goes wrong. And that's where we need to do more work, I think.
On these things, a question for Pierre Olivier. You have been speaking at the IMF, not so much on Europe, on the geopolitical pattern of trade and what this implies also in terms of currencies, use of invoicing currencies. Can you say 2 words? We have 1 minute before the question of the public.
In 1 minute. On the pattern of currency invoicing, I don't think we are seeing, as of now, I mean, the data doesn't come in very high frequency, so it might take a little while before we see things. But we are not seeing major movements. I mean, what's interesting is if you're looking at, I mean, we live in a dollar world to a large extent, in trade invoicing, financing, and bond issuance, et cetera, and then in reserve accumulation. And the one place where you might see a little bit more of a decline in the importance of the dollar is the sort of the headline numbers you get from reserve, the share of dollar reserves in total reserves. That's been coming down from around 71% to about 55% for those countries that report their reserve holdings. And it's not as dramatic as you might think, because some of this is, you know, countries that are reserve managers that are going into Canadian dollars or Australian dollars. I don't think of these as dramatically different from a geopolitical and geostrategic sense from the US. But nothing much in terms of currency of bond issuance or trade issuance yet. But it's certainly the case that we will see more in that direction, the more decoupling, the more fragmentation we have. I mean, I think it's inevitable that at some point, and we're seeing some discussions already in some pilot projects, that the rewiring, if you want, of the underlying pipelines will be happening.
I guess we should open for questions from the floor. Marco Butin the first. And please introduce yourself. I introduce Marco.
Okay, thank you very much. No, illuminating panels with many questions. By the way, Giancarlo didn't mention it at the beginning, but we are running together an EMU laboratory, so all these things that you put on the table are actually relevant for the work we are going to plan in the next months. I have two questions related. One is that, I mean, we as economists, we tend to be pro-cyclical ourselves. So we don't like being pro-cyclical in terms of policy, but we are ourselves. So is there a risk that, you know, looking through the current, you know, inflation acceleration, now deceleration, we actually go back to the lowflation of the previous years? I mean, several of the, I think Pierre Olivier mentioned that several of the elements that were structurally there have not disappeared. So if one looks at this as essentially a supply shock, and having controlled the dynamics in that is, are we going to see again, you know, a lowflation thing? So the second question is that, I mean, I remember many years ago when I worked at the Commission, when we did, you know, projections on debt sustainability with a debt accumulation equation, we ran that with an interest rate growth rate differential of 2%. Between 1 and 3, 2 was what we did many years ago. Now, are we going to be in a debt trap? Now, if you go back to Olivier Blanchard back in the 1980s with the maximum politically feasible primary surplus, that's what he defined there, I mean, if you look at what you said also on inflation, on investment needs, maximum politically primary surplus is likely to go down in the future. You have a lot of spending. On the revenue side, a lot of political pressures not to increase it, actually. And so if you have, you know, higher interest rate growth differential, and you have a maximum politically feasible primary surplus actually going down, how do we get out of the debt trap we are in?
Do you want to react immediately or we pick up?
This is for you. Okay, I'm happy to.
Perhaps I mean, also for Sylvain.
You've heard a little bit what I said about, yes. So on the lowflation, the risk, I think, I mean, right now there are different definition of what R-star is and at what horizon. But and the real rates are certainly much higher now, even the short run than they were, let's say, 4 years ago. But there are scenarios where they would go back down. And in fact, in the chapter of the World Economic Outlook we put out last year, we were looking at that question, and we're finding that on the whole, the forces pushing down the natural rate we're still likely to be there and to dominate. Now, it's anyone's guess what productivity growth is going to be, and that's a big question in terms of thinking about our star. We know it's been coming down a lot in the last 20, 25 years. There are a number of factors behind this. There are a number of these things that maybe could be reversed. Maybe AI will, generate huge productivity. Who knows? I don't think anyone has any clue at this point whether, on one hand, if you listen to Daron Acemoglu, it will be peanuts, and if you listen to others, it will be untold riches. I don't think we have any sensible estimate. So on the whole, I think it's likely there are very good assumptions where it would remain low. But as I said, that doesn't change the fact that funding for debt could actually be high. So on your second point, how do you solve the budget equation, especially in the euro area? You have limited political appetite for generating primary surpluses. You have higher interest rates. You have lower growth. And you have all these needs for funding. How do you solve that? I think that you have to sort of work on trying to increase the denominator. You have to try to increase growth. You have to try to increase do structural reforms, and then you also, I think, there is you have to try to apply as much as you can the subsidiarity principle, which is to move to the European level a number of the funding for a number of common public goods rather than to have it in a decentralized way at the national level, which is inefficient. And I think in that space you could have climate for sure. I think I will agree with Laurence that you could have a lot of defense spending could be moved to that space. And then you can think about what are the resources you could generate at the European level that you don't have at the national level. And here, we did some work at the fund last year. We looked at an untapped fiscal resource, if you want. What is this untapped fiscal resource? Well, it's the convenience yield from a true European safe asset. That convenience yield is effectively a subsidy to the debt issuers. It's not tapped because it's not issued right now at scale. I mean, you might argue that some countries actually collect some convenience yield to some extent, but it's certainly not a large market. And so you can think of the present value of that convenience yield as an untapped fiscal resource that could help funding a number of projects. Now, when we did the calculations of the fund last year, we came up with a number that is not negligible. It was around 12%, 15% of EU GDP. That seems pretty large compared, to some of the fiscal challenges we're facing now.
Maybe to add two points. So we have to remind ourselves that debt sustainability, it does not depend on the level of debt, but the trend, right? And so we can deal with current levels of debt in the EU, provided they don't explode and come down slowly. And then the question is whether the current fiscal framework, the new one, is too ambitious in the speed with which it wants debt to turn around, given all the other fiscal needs we have. And here, my answer would be the same as Pierre Olivier's. It's probably not too ambitious, but it does, I think, assume that something complementary will happen at the EU level. And I know you agree with that too. And that complementary thing is both related to efficiency, but also to common funding. And then, on the question of how we deal with, adverse differentials of RNG within the EU. I mean, for me, the really interesting thing is what in the end has the RRF yielded, particularly here, right? So we have a big debate right now going on in Italy, whether the RRF was a big waste of money or whether the RRF was what we hoped it would be, which was transformative, and so time will tell. But if indeed we were to raise productivity growth in Italy by anywhere between 0.3, 0.5, something like that, I think that would, when combined with some restraint in spending, that would indeed solve the problem.
If there is no Bartraud, it's a question in the front. Don't know whether Laurence want to come in, but
Thank you.
Waltraud
Cherklif, political economist at the EUI. It is noticeable that on this panel and in online, there's not a single central banker who were, the only game in town a while ago. And that even somebody like Jeromin Zettelmeyer, who's in the game for a long time, says he doesn't understand what balance sheet inflation is. I mean, we discussed it some time ago as leveraging and over-leveraging. That is balance sheet inflation. And so my question really is for Sylvain Johansson, whose contribution was closest to mine, because I sense a very structuralist view of inflation now and of macroeconomic policy on the panel, when I think we still live in a world in which finance drives business and cyclicality and is the problem of getting out of the woods now. So what role does macroprudential play in this shrinking of balance sheet inflation?
So, you know, I'm not sure I have an exact answer for you. If we think about the balance sheet inflation, one view is obviously to say we want to mean revert, get out of this. Not all levels of inflation are necessarily bad for this. There are different scenarios. As long as it comes with investments, as it comes with productivity growth, there are ways, I mean, some version of higher for longer productivity accelerations could lead to less of that leverage, which, you know, there's one view where we say we feel better about this because it creates buffers, it creates more degrees of freedom. So it's not necessarily that high is good or low is bad, or the opposite. What is more worrying is the version where we have continuous secular stagnation, negative real interest rates, you know, low investments, and then we just continue to inflate, because then we may be making the problem worse. So, no, Fiona.
I just want to say one point. So I do understand that leverage is dangerous and so forth, but there are trade-offs, and so one particular trade-off is behind my earlier, you know, suggestion that maybe the way we should deal with the large ECB balance sheet right now is not by shrinking it, but by changing its composition, and rather than selling bonds, issuing ECB bonds. And of course, what I had in mind, but Pierre-Olivier did not take the bait, is that this would be one way of creating an EU-level safe asset. In a sense, it is a unique opportunity to doing so, right? Most safe asset ideas, synthetic safe assets, are based on the idea that you have an intermediary that has essentially a liability side. The liability side consists of EU sovereign bonds, but they're very diversified. And then the asset side, you issue a common safe asset. So essentially all of these ideas are structured around that. And this is something we have quite naturally now, because the ECB does have this large liability side. Now it has the choice. It can either sell them back off into the market, or it can actually issue the EU safe asset. So it's sort of quite tempting to go down that road. At least it deserves a discussion, particularly if you argue that this has a very high convenience yield. The little twist is that, you know, most of these safe asset ideas want to create safety not just based on diversification, but also on some sort of seniority, and that is missing here, right? So you would have essentially a pari passu EU ECB bond that is backed by sovereign bonds, but maybe diversification is enough, particularly if the issuer is the ECB that everyone trusts to be able to repay anyway.
You want to come back on this, Bert?
Me?
Laurence.
Oh, Laurence.
No, I thought, sorry. No, I find perhaps we should be looking a little more at is the sound okay?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Perhaps we should be looking a little more at what's happening outside of the EU and get a little less pessimistic. First, I'm going to answer to Pierre-Olivier earlier remarks. We have lots of savings which are funding debt, governmental debt. We need those savings, and they're into short-term vehicles. We need those savings to go to the energy transition, to research and development in AI and so on. I'm not trying to do coercion, but we should ask ourselves why this is the case in the US and it's not in Europe. Okay, and I think it can be the case in Europe. We just can't put the money that we have sitting on bank deposit and in life insurance in equities. Europeans don't buy equity. They should be buying equity, and that's going to strengthen our industries. And that brings me to the question that was just asked now. I don't think finance is an issue. The financial risks are much higher when they're being taken in the US. And yes, they have more growth, more dynamic, and they're more ahead of us in terms of AI. Instead of trying to even more regulate finance in the EU, we should actually try to have financial regulation that help channel our savings towards long-term and more risky investment. And this is being done in the US. And in terms of debt level, and that will be my last point, I want to come to the rescue of Jeromin. It doesn't need it, but that's okay. Look at Japan. Japan starts having inflation, and under the control of Pierre Olivier, it starts having much higher productivity, thanks to robots and robotics and the artificial intelligence industry. So I guess the question we should be asking ourselves is, what has Japan done that we have not done yet, knowing that they have a much bigger demographic issue and they have been having it for a longer time. So I think there are solutions. We need to be more optimistic and more pro-risk than what we have been in the past by channeling these savings into the investment that we need for being a prosperous economy tomorrow. Thank you. Sorry, it was a bit emotional, but optimistic, I hope.
You wanted to come? No, is there?
I just want to briefly say my question for macroprudential, which is not a new regulation, it's applying an existing regulation. And we all talked a lot about the macroprudential turn. Is there a role for this? And Jeromin, while I appreciate that you renew this, and it's a beautiful idea, this SBs, it requires a democratic decision. You can't introduce Eurobonds just on the back of the ECB. Such things have to be openly taken in political venues, not by the ECB, I'm afraid.
Oh, let me just say one thing. So first, unless I misunderstood the question, but on macroprudential policies, I think the evidence suggests that they've been very useful in containing and dealing with some of the risks that otherwise tend to build in the financial sector. And I think on this, the recent episode, I mean, and they're not perfect, and there are a lot of things that can be improved, but the recent episode a year ago of the regional banking turmoil pointed out to the contrast between what you had in the US, for instance, and Europe, was a good example of, in the US, as has been recognized publicly by the Federal Reserve, a failure of supervision and regulation of some of these regional banks. By contrast, in the European context, which was often described as the weak man of the world in terms of its banking industry, very heavy, very low return on equity, very high investment costs, fixed costs, weathered that financial tension fairly well, despite the failure of a much larger institution in the European context, Credit Suisse. So I think there is a lot to be said with the measures that have been put in place, whether it's capital ratios, whether it's countercyclical buffers, etc., that have been making the system more resilient. No complacency here. I think we know that the worst crises are often financial crisis. I mean, in terms of the cost, the damage that can be inflicted on an economy from a financial crisis is unparalleled. So it has to be monitored very, very carefully. And I would agree with you there that we cannot just let finance run free. But I think a lot of progress has been made.
If I may abuse my position, I would like to go back to Laurent's introduction. So the idea of the European community as a strong, large economy that is sort of punching way below its weight. And, we talk about growth, inclusiveness. At this point, there is also an issue of existential threat that is looming in the horizon. So if from Mars, if you look at Europe, you have an enormous amount of saving, very little investment, a lot of innovation that is created in Europe and goes elsewhere to grow. We are all aging. It's crazy. And everybody thinks that by closing the border, we can, sort of the leveraging, decoupling, a little bit of stealth financial repression, we are secure, not seeing that we are actually descaling. So the question is there a way to explain democratically that technical solution, institutional solutions are a way to sort of keep going? Let me say keep going.
And
perhaps
get out of
even
the wood.
better. So the question I have also on this balance sheet, for example, we learned that we gamble through many crises by borrowing. We also learned that on top of gambling, we need to put value at risk in our decisions. No policy decision is without risk. We learned to guarantee firm investment instead of giving them. See, like there's all this kind of evolution also the way we think about. So what would be your reaction to this issue of how to explain this very simple, candid observation?
So I think there are two parts of what I think you see as the technical solution, one of which is much easier to explain than the other. The one that's easy to explain is the costs of non-Europe, the need for unity, the need to break down internal market barriers, because this is all sort of inefficient nonsense that has to do with our historical traditions, and this is an argument that was made by Jean Monnet in the early 1950s, right? It's been around, we can make it more actively, and by the way, a very nice way of making the argument is the Letta report, right? The Letta report gets the credit for invigorating the political case for the single market, so that one can be explained. The one that is harder to explain is maintaining international integration and openness, because here the argument that will inevitably come back to you is that we are the last to turn the other cheek, right? So everyone goes nationalist, everyone goes nasty, everyone goes for subsidies, and why should we be the only ones not to do it? And so we can basically take the view, well, they are they're not necessarily acting even in their own interest. It's not sustainable, which, by the way, at the fiscal level, I think is true. So I don't think that either what China is doing nor what the US is doing is sustainable. The question is, will they kill European manufacturing in the meantime? So there is a much more difficult case to make there. And frankly, I think this is not an area where we can go with a corner solution. So we will need to adjust somewhat, but we will have to do it very judiciously, because otherwise we will throw out the baby with the bathwater.
I think we have 1 minute of this, show me. So anybody has 30 seconds. Important. Sylvain.
Or Laurence.
Pierre Olivier. Laurence.
Thanks. Then two quick things. I think for the car manufacturing, Jeromin, we will have to do it, and at the European level, because it's too important for us. It's 20% of Germany value added, if I'm not wrong, and it's jobs that people value. So it's that, or we're all going to lose the next election. We need to preserve this industry, but at the European level. Second thing, I think for the financial risk, for people to take a bit more appetite, and my apologies for the macroprudential, you're right, but for financial risk, pension funds, I think people will get some appetite for it when they get the reward of capitalism and firms growing. So that's why pension funds have an educational way of getting it, because you save €1 for your retirement and you get more than that once you're retired. And we need to think a bit harder about this. Thank you. 30 seconds.
So, Giorgia, we may ask everybody to a round of applause for our panelists. I think this brings the applause. And as Marco Butti explained, we have now this new outcome of this new institution inside the initiative inside the UI, which is the EMU Lab, which will offer as a laboratory for thinking, analysis, and proposal on these issues. Thank you again.
Thank you. Thanks.
Welcome, everybody. Welcome to this session on resilient economies and institutions to mitigate and adapt to climate change. My name is Simone Borghesi. I am the director of FSR Climate, the climate research area at the Florence School of Regulation of the European University Institute. And I will be co-chairing the session together with Fabrizia Mealli, who is professor of econometrics at the European University Institute. This event is organized under the framework of the Horizon Project SPES and also in collaboration with the European Association of Environmental and Resource Economists. We are going to discuss a very hot topic in all respects. We're talking about climate change. And the consideration starts from the fact that the frequency and the severity of disasters, natural disasters due to climate change is increasing over time. And our institutions are not always ready to cope with these problems. This applies in particular to the emerging and developing economies, but also to the European Union. So these raise the questions that we want to address today. How to increase the resiliency to climate change? How to better prepare our economies, our societies to climate change. And here I'm referring to agriculture, I'm referring to biodiversity, health, so in a holistic view. And most importantly, how to protect the most vulnerable to climate change. To discuss these complex issues today, we have 4 distinguished panelists that I'm going to introduce. First of all, Hans-Martin Füssel, and let me say a few words. Hans-Martin is climate change adaptation expert at the European Environment Agency. He has coordinated the EU climate risk assessment. He works at PEAK, has worked at Stanford, has worked at Kyoto, and in many institutions. He has contributed to the vulnerability assessment frameworks with groundbreaking contribution, I would say, and contributed also to the IPCC report and as consultant to many institutions worldwide. Thank you for being here, Hans-Martin.
Thank you.
Then we have Shonali Pachauri. Shonali is the research group leader of the Transformative Institutional and Social Solutions Research Group in the Energy, Climate and Environment program at IASA. She has acted as director of the former Transition to New Technologies program and senior research scholar in the former Energy program at IASA. Shonali is a young professor at the Yale Forestry and Environmental Studies. She has a master from UCL and PhD from the ETH in Zurich. And she has been leading author of the IPCC AR6, so the 6th assessment report. Thank you for being here, Shonali. Our third speaker is Massamba Thioye. He learned me how to pronounce. I hope I got it right. Massamba is a leading figure in the climate action as serving for the mitigation division of the UNFCCC Secretariat. Massamba is working on measuring climate action and innovation for climate initiatives. He has given groundbreaking contribution on green bonds, greenhouse gas accounting, particularly for cities. And Massamba is also the recipient of many prestigious awards. Massamba, you're very welcome. And finally, last but not least, let me stress this, we have Mira Manini Tiwari. And, I'm trying to get all surnames right. Mira is a research assistant at the University of Siena and at the European University Institute. She's work is on building climate resilience, foster global equity. She has a background in education policy from the University of Cambridge, and she keeps working on communities, the participation of citizens, public acceptance, and many important issues that we're going to discuss today. She participated in various projects at the Florence School of Regulation, no time to mention them all, and in the Agritech project at the University of Siena, which is a project on decarbonization of the agri-food sector and on global justice on climate change. So, 2 words more on the structure of the session. We will ask 3 questions, overarching questions, to each of the panelists, asking them to reply briefly in a couple of minutes, so that we then have the time to open the floor to questions from you, from the audience. And on this note, I change page, and I go first, okay, Fabrizia, and then move to you, we alternate. So my first question, overarching question is, what is really needed to ensure our economies are resilient to climate change? I know it's a difficult question. What are the feasible means to enhance the long-term resilience rather than only short-term emergency responses? And I would ask with Massamba, if you don't mind. Massamba, you know, I know that you're a super expert in the work of UNFCCC. So I would like to know your view and your experience based on the work that you do at UNFCCC.
Thank you. Good morning to all of you. Very pleased to have the opportunity to participate to this very important debate. There are several elements that need to be in place if we want to address the longer-term challenge of climate and sustainability. First, we need to mainstream climate and sustainability action into development action by putting in place longer-term, low-emission development strategy that can inform the development of national sectoral strategy, as well as subnational strategy and the NDCs, so that we have all these different components aligned. Second aspect, we need to fully leverage digital technology, because the green transition will necessarily be a twin green and digital transition. Third, we need to accelerate and upscale the development of innovative solutions for transformative action. So far, the focus has been put on actions that are needed, but that are not among the most transformative. We need first to look at actions that can disrupt products that have high negative externality, and then actions that enable to enhance the efficiency at use of products and services. Third, we need to prioritize action that can enhance the circularity of products and services, and only after that, we focus on reducing the negative externality. Unfortunately, currently, the main focus has been put on reducing the negative externality of products and services. This is about how do we reduce the carbon footprint of the cement sector, how do we reduce the carbon footprint of iron and steel. These are needed action, but they are not the most transformative one. The most transformative one is those actions that can actually disrupt this product or enhance the efficiency of their use or enhance their circularity. We need also to undertake action on finance so that we can redirect private finance to our green investment. So for example, it could be done using green supporting factor that require less capital reserve for green investment. And finally, we need to act to facilitate the inner development of citizens, because we need to have citizens that are ready to act if you want to have something that is sustainable. Back to you.
Thank you, Massamba.
Okay, so my question to Shonali. As lead author of the assessment report of the IPCC, and also based on your own work, what is your view on the needs for resilient economies?
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. And firstly, let me say it's an honor and a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation. So, you know, this last assessment report very clearly highlighted that even with the increased ambition that many nations have shown, we are currently on a path to 3 degrees. This means we will see increasing risks of impacts. And unfortunately, those impacts the risks of those impacts are going to be felt by the most vulnerable who have actually contributed the least to the problem. It's very clear in terms of what we need to do, and we've known that for a long time now. And the report very clearly highlights that we need transformations in 6 directions at least to achieve what we want, which is the goal of the 1.5 degrees agreed at Paris. We need not only transformations of the energy system, which we hear a lot about, which is, of course, decarbonizing and renewables and energy efficiency, but we need transformations also of our agricultural systems. Agricultural sector contributes a huge amount to our greenhouse gas emissions, and there are a number of opportunities to reduce that through better land management, through better food supply systems, through more climate resilient agricultural systems, and so on and so forth. In addition, we need to transform our urban areas and our urban infrastructure. This is again something that we know about, we know how to do as well, but in fact, we are lacking in terms of the action and implementation on this. We need to change our economic and financial systems. We've heard about that, and our previous speaker already alluded to that. We know that the investments are not what they need to be, and they're not flowing to the regions where this needs to happen. So we definitely need to be doing that as well. And we also need to be talking about transforming our cultural and social systems. We don't talk about that enough, but there is a lot that can be done on the behavioral side in terms of changing how we live, how we commute, how we work, how we eat, and how we enjoy our free time. These are things that are easy to do, but require strong commitment, strong investment, strong government backing, and in some places it's happening, and in other places it's just not happening. And finally, of course, governance and institutions. None of this will happen without strong governance and institutions, and that means really building capacities in those areas, in those parts of the world where these institutions and governance are the weakest currently, and where actually a lot of development will occur, and where there is a huge scope to mitigate and adapt to climate change. I'll stop with that.
Please.
Thank you. We are asking your experience, based on your work. So I now revert to Hans Martin. What is your view based on your work at the EEA?
Yeah, thank you. Good morning, first of all, and it's really a pleasure and an honor to be here. The EEA has just published the first European climate risk assessment. We call it UCRA. And in UCRA, we identify and assess 36 major climate risks for Europe, risks that could bring Europe in trouble, to say it very simply. And we assess the severity over time. We look at the evidence base And we also look at the policy context. And maybe in relation to the question, one of the innovative elements is we look at the time dimension, both on the risk side, how the risks develop, but also on how much time do policies actually need to be implemented? What is the decision horizon, the planning horizon? And based on this, we identify the urgency to act, focus at the European level. So my answers will focus, of course, on the European context. I mean, as the previous speaker said, there is no one silver bullet, no one solution to address this. First of all, the climate risks differ very significantly across Europe. Parts of Spain are experiencing an extreme drought, whereas Ireland, where I had the pleasure to speak last week, has just experienced probably the wettest year on record, and both of them with severe impacts on agriculture and beyond that. And also, of course, the risks differ across sectors and systems. If you're trying to protect outdoor workers, the health risks, the livelihood risks from heat waves, you need different policies compared to trying to protect supply chains from climate impacts abroad. And of course, also different countries and regions have different governance contexts and preparedness. But there are a number of key lessons from the European Climate Risk Assessment and further work the EA does. I think first it's important to say that the past is no longer a good guide for the future. Anyone who deals with long-term decisions needs to consider not just the current climate context and the current climate risks, but also the future risk context. Because even in those cases where the risks are not yet critical, action may be needed now. Otherwise, we leave our children or society where infrastructure is placed in flood-prone areas or where buildings become heat traps in the increasingly severe heat waves. So the long-term thinking is important here. Second, we need a serious discussion about risk ownership, because it's, in particular when transformational changes are needed, what is the role of the public sector? And then in the European context, what is the role of the EU versus national versus subnational governments and entities? Which risks can be covered by business and households? But then in this context, how do we ensure fairness? Because not everybody is in the same position to address, to manage, to cover risks. And maybe as a last point, we may also need to develop the narrative a bit further. If we speak, and at least for some audiences, if we speak about climate adaptation, it sounds either like a narrow environmental policy or some retroactive adaptation or even like fatalistic failure. But that's not what we're actually talking about. Addressing current and future climate risks, this is good economic policy, it's good social policy, it's good health policy, and if we develop this narrative, then hopefully we can also include actors who might not so easily respond to the bit more technical or narrow terms. I'll stop with here for now.
All right. Thanks a lot, Hans Martin. So my question to Mira. So what is your view on this, not only based on your work, but also based on your, as part of a generation that is that is facing right now, short-term emergencies, but will also have to cope in the future with the long-term consequences of all of that.
Thank you, and thanks for having me. I think there are two main elements. In this part, I'll speak a bit more about our experience as a generation, and there's plenty of time for our work later. I think, firstly, our generation has grown up, thanks to social media, with all of its ills, with a consistent exposure to very first-hand experiences of some of the most profound vulnerabilities that exist in the world. This means that most of our generation is either entering the working world or even has grown up with an awareness that there are vulnerabilities and realities that we have historically not known in the minority world, that we can no longer continue to therefore speak for the majority world and those most vulnerable when creating these policies, but also that not speaking for them doesn't mean leaving them the double burden of experiencing the vulnerability and having to advocate for the support they need. So it involves very, very strong listening to those voices and amplifying them in our position of privilege to say, this is where help is needed, and this is why, and these are the voices directly from those affected. I think connected to that recounting of experience is that our generation largely views climate change and climate resilience in terms of intersections of vulnerabilities. So you know that if you are vulnerable to climate risks, you are also probably vulnerable to healthcare risks and basic service, lack of basic services, historically marginalized with colonial, post-colonial, or neo-colonial practices. And to give a couple of examples of how that's been manifesting over time and over space, when Amitav Ghosh, the author, interviewed migrants who'd come from Bangladesh to Italy, he went in with the expectation, or with this theory, that they would unequivocally state that they were climate migrants. And actually very few of them did, because they knew that their situation was the product of historical, socioeconomic, geopolitical, and climate factors that were a consequence of that. They didn't expect it to be reduced down to one factor. But this goes back hundreds and hundreds of years. In the United States, when we had the states kind of forming as we know it and the settlers arrived, there's written documentation of how much they anonymized the causes of many native deaths, putting it down to environmental factors like disease, the spread of livestock, the changes of the land and forest, which were actually actions deliberately and knowingly propagated by those settlers that caused that ecological destruction and death. We cannot anonymize the causes of climate vulnerability today. And I think our generation knows that because these sectors have all come together to cause the problems that we're facing, these sectors have to all work together to fix the problem. So health policy, social policy, economic policy, fixing these inequities at a global level. And it's not enough to say that it's not possible just because they haven't been targeted systemically in the past.
Okay, thanks a lot. So I'd like now to introduce the second broad question, which is in fact a little bit more specific on the shaping of policies to cope with climate change, and also in key areas such as agriculture, biodiversity, health, and so on. So I would like to start with Hans Martin. So what's your opinion on the EU Green Deal? Do you think this is enough, or what is your take on that?
I mean, I have to say, as an institution, the EA does not have opinions about specific EU policies. But having said this, I think it's fair to say that the holistic approach that was attempted in the EU Green Deal does respond to repeated calls in EA work, such as the State and Outlook of the Environment Report. So one could say it responds to those calls, which is a good sign forward. And this needs to be further developed, this proactive and holistic approach. You ask whether it's enough. Now, the Green Deal has been an important step forward, and it has been guiding policies in the current EU policy cycle. And in fact, even the first European climate risk assessment is in a way a child of the Green Deal. However, our findings show that the current policy framework in here, once again I'm focusing on Europe, the current policy framework, but also the implementation, is not keeping track with the fast increase in climate risks that we see. So very clearly further action is needed here in developing and implementing policies. So the Commission needs to act after the European Parliament elections, hopefully with a strong mandate from the voters. And it's also clear that particular attention is needed here in those areas, in those sectors that manage large climate-sensitive resources, or where the EU has a significant policy leverage. So examples include agriculture and forestry, because they manage large amounts of climate-sensitive resources, but also cohesion policy, where actually a lot of the EU funding is going. And we also need to look at cross-cutting aspects, such as spatial planning, disaster risk management, because those actions determine to a large degree our future and current vulnerability.
Thanks a lot.
I move to Mira. There is a question that I'd like to ask you. I would like to know your opinion on the conflict potentially conflicting goals around land use. I know this is a topic we've been discussing together. In particular, looking at the heated debate on the nature restoration law. I know we discuss it, but I'd like you to share your view with all the audience.
Yeah, the reason for my expression there is because this is a really, really messy topic. And there, of course, is no one opinion as to how we're supposed to be using our limited land. But I do think there are certain principles that we should be following. So firstly, we have to recognize that agrobiodiversity and policies for ecosystem restoration are repeatedly found to be important for food security, for climate resilience, for incomes, etc. So the baseline of setting out these policies is important and justified. I also think that we need to set out a principle of not taking on double standards. So something that we've spoken about is if you have resistance in a context, a resistance to policies that threaten your sovereignty over how you manage your land. If you are also from a context that's buying carbon offsets in another part of the world that imposes projects that have that same rigidity on how they manage their land, that's a tension in which you need to look inward at how you are justifying the rights over land use and how you operate. But that's at a very discursive level. The reality is that most of the farms in the world are smallholder farms. And this debate around, what are the ethics of our carbon offsets is not changing the fact that they are facing very real vulnerabilities and fragilities. In the Netherlands, where we've seen the most resistance and the most forward action on the nitrogen regulations, the livestock sector, which is most affected by these nitrogen regulations, is also the sector that is disproportionately affected by suicide rates. So this is real community instability and a real question of resilience that we have to be addressing. There are a lot of factors that brought us where we are today, but looking at a couple of institutional factors, since that's what we're talking about. It recently came out that in the early 2000s, the Food and Agriculture Organization heavily censored reports around the impacts of livestock on climate change and on the environment. In that phase, very, very powerful lobbies succeeded in dampening not only the communication about this, but even allegedly some of the statistics that were reported about the responsibility for the emissions we have today. And that's 2 decades of time that was lost in setting out very important standards and very important understandings of how we're supposed to work with our land use. That means that today the regulations do have to be drastic and do come as quite a shock because we've reached that tipping point far too late, now that it's come out more in the public discourse. At the second level, I looked into some of the public consultations and feedback sessions around these land use policies in the EU. And a few key things came out, obviously, among many others. One was that farmers felt really undermined by these policies. So historically, you are custodians of the land. You've probably done these practices for generations. And naturally, it's human to defend yourself if you feel told that your practices are the ills of all the earth. And that's an understanding that has to be put in place at the beginning. You're dealing with human beings. The second thing that came out, and it's tied to the third, which was they felt that the EU hadn't learned from more bottom-up approaches to building these policies. They hadn't learned how to build clarity and participation in really making these policies ground level and understood and owned by the actors. So the EU has the advantage of massive networks of actors that can facilitate this. You have trade associations, you have mayoral associations. There needs to be a deep responsibility among those actors to solicit opinions and input from the farmers on the ground, but all the way through the policy, not only now at the point of critical debate, all the way through when those reports come out for the past 2 decades, you need to be soliciting those inputs, aggregating them in a meaningful and responsible way, and bringing them up the levels so that there's ownership from the point of engagement to the point of implementation. Maybe this is something also that Shonali, or later we might talk about that. She has this concept of participatory justice in a paper that her and her colleagues came out with recently. The importance of being part of the creation of a policy and the implementation of it all the way through.
Okay, thank you. So my question to Shonali. So a key concept that was put forward in the latest IPCC report was this notion of climate resilient development pathways. So how do you think those can be designed?
Yeah, so just in a nutshell, the climate resilient development pathways basically is talking about looking at improving resilience by basically firstly integrating mitigation and adaptation with sustainable development, and then keeping equity and inclusivity at the heart of all the action. And so just as an example, I can give you just one example. When we talk about thinking about action within development of the building sector, for example, right? Now, in much of the global south, housing is not assured to everyone. There are still large parts of the population that don't have access to adequate housing. And that means one will have to design a lot more new building infrastructure in these parts of the world. Now, these are regions that will also increasingly face the risks of climate change, particularly heat extremes and wet and dry extremes. And that means there is an opportunity there to really think about integrating and designing these multi-objective policies that really take into account the fact that there is a need for increasing housing, that this housing needs to be well insulated and well constructed, and it has to be low income, affordable to low income people. So it really requires changing the way we are doing policy, in making it much more integrated, in thinking about the policies in a very much more multi-objective way, and then really keeping equity at the center of the equation.
Thank you.
Massamba, what's the UNFCCC perspective of this issue?
I fully agree with what have been just said. The challenge is that we are good in solving problems, but we are less good in avoiding them. And this is related to the way that we are setting goals and policies. They are not multi-purpose. And most of the time, we do not separate between three key elements: goal, the means, and the constraints. Of course, sustainability involves three dimensions: social, economical, and ecological. But these three dimensions do not play the same role. The social dimension is the goal. The economical dimension is important, but it is just a means. And then the ecological dimension is a constraint. So the current narrative, I think, could be improved, because we talk a lot about decarbonizing the economy, and this is because we are focusing only on that we miss a lot of other things, and sometimes our response create new problem. I think we need to see our climate action as having for purpose providing well-being to the people, the many people, everybody, and the planet. So it means that the starting point should be, how do we satisfy the core human needs of shelter, nutrition and health, access to products and services, leisure, while being aligned with the climate and sustainability goal, while being within the paceway of 1.5 degree, while contributing to enhance biodiversity, while contributing to land regeneration, and while consuming natural resources within the planetary boundary. And this is how we set the goal. And the response should also be integrated, because the big challenge of climate and sustainability cannot be addressed only working on specific type of policy. We need to combine climate policy with investment policy, technology push policy, and technology pull policy. And even policies alone will not suffice. I always say that we did not shift from horse to car by taxing the horses. There is a need for innovation from the private sector. There is a need for investment for the deployment of the innovation. So it means that innovative policy need to be combined with innovative financial instrument, innovative business model, innovative cooperative approach, because this requires radical collaboration among nations and within nations, and also innovative product from the culture and creative industry, because it's all about adoption. We can have good policy, good technology, but if the many people are not willing to adopt to them, they will not be effective.
Thank you. Fabrizia?
Maybe we can, no, I think we can go to the third question. And I'm happy to...
Okay, I move to the last one.
Yes.
We have difficult questions for you today, but... and my last question would be how to protect the most vulnerable communities and population globally. I know it's, again, a difficult one, but that's what you're here for. Yeah. And I will start with Shonali. In particular, how should we give greater attention to, in climate policy, to the most marginalized populations?
Yeah, so this is, of course, a very tough question, and we have no easy answers to it. But I think one of the things that increasingly has been recognized and is also being acted upon in some cases is the fact that we know that without equity and inclusivity, as I mentioned before, we are not going to solve the problem. We are seeing a lot of pushback in some places and resistance in other places to aggressive policies, also because they are not taking into account these justice concerns adequately. And that really means understanding who is going to be impacted, who are the winners and losers in the implementation of a policy, and then designing the policies in ways that you safeguard those, that you have social protection for those who will, in the short term, maybe bear costs for the policy. And this really also requires fundamentally understanding the fact that at the moment, unfortunately, in many parts of the world, we don't have gender equity, we don't have social equity. We have a lot of inequality everywhere. And if we are not talking about these things when we are talking about addressing climate, then unfortunately we are leaving behind a large part of the population that firstly is already impacted by climate change, but then also who could potentially be part of the solution to climate change. So unless you really empower and provide an opportunity for all genders, for all communities to be part of the solution, we're not going to get where we want to get.
My question to Massamba, and also related to what Shonali just said. So in order to design policies, we also need to understand or know who are the most vulnerable. And vulnerable population, I understand, and I also see in my own work, are different in different places. So what is your view on that or experience?
Yeah, so I agree with you that vulnerable people, marginalized people, we can find them everywhere in developing countries as well as in developed countries. I think the starting point is to understand what are their needs in terms of climate and sustainability solution. Because they are marginalized most of the time, we do not take the effort needed to engage with them and have a good understanding of what are their needs in terms of climate and sustainability solution. Second, when we will develop the response to this need, it has to be inclusive, it has to be participative, they need to be empowered so that they can contribute. And here there are two elements that in my view are really critical. The first, particularly if you want to have on board developing countries, first, as I said, the green transition will necessarily be a twin digital and green transition. So it means that digital technology needs to be made accessible everywhere for everybody. This is important for the Global South to leapfrog. In the Global North, most of the infrastructures that are needed to provide well-being to the many people are already in place. In the Global South, they are to be built. And most of the time, we can satisfy the needs through digital technology without having to build infrastructure. So if we manage to have good virtual education that can provide the same level of services to the kids without building school, it will enable the Global South to leapfrog. And finally, we need to make accessible low-cost finance, because otherwise there is no possibility to implement climate and sustainability action.
Mira, may I build upon this answer and ask you, how can we act with local communities from your perspective?
Yes. Yeah, really, I'm glad actually to come after Shonali and Massamba's answers, because they draw on a lot of common topics. Sounds like a bit of a no-brainer, but actually start engaging with those communities. Our colleagues who are working on the SPES project that Simone mentioned earlier looked into the beneficiaries of science, technology, and innovation policies around the world. And they did a deep dive into a few contexts. And they found that in Italy and France, there were no or almost no civil society beneficiaries of science, technology, and innovation policies, or STI. By contrast, in Colombia and South Africa, you had up to 20% of civil society beneficiaries. Why this matters is because your civil society actors, as Shonali and Massamba are saying, tend to be the ones who are most connected to the local communities, who know what's happening on the ground. Across these policies, across the world, equity was minimally present as a theme or as a focus of these policies. So there was innovation, which is a great word, but that innovation was being targeted towards innovation that is not supposed to be at its core made equitable from the outset, yes, or to be driving equity from the outset. Nature was almost absent all the way through, so you can drive innovation, you can drive science and technology, but if you're then having to figure out how to compensate for that and fix your natural environment as a result, you're again not doing it from the outset. Connected to this is very important, is the very important element of integrated research. And here the realm of data comes in. We're experiencing this firsthand in our work in agritech in the University of Siena. We're simply trying to collect data on carbon farming from a very small set of actors, and to develop harmonized, meaningful, local data that these actors who are still in the minority world and still in a wealthy region of Italy, to choose those indicators as indicators that they are able to provide is very difficult, let alone when you're going at a global level. It's something we're working on in knowledge governance and transformations, on the role of localized indicators and how are you using different technologies to find data that really comes from local communities. But a very kind of contrasting element that is currently contrasting but needs to be brought in is qualitative data. In a lot of NGOs around the world, specifically in Eastern and Southern Africa, there's a model of a very small team that's very, very, very local and works to address a 360-degree spectrum of development in that context, because they know the context really well. And as we said at the beginning, you can't address one problem without addressing the other. The problem is funding is usually reliant on you being able to submit several randomized control trials that prove that your intervention works. How are you supposed to do that if you are a small team operating on multiple different interventions? We need to be shifting our finance system, as Massamba said, not only making it low cost, but being ready to accept that qualitative, very local data that gives us a deeper understanding of that context, financing those actors to be able to undertake those studies because they're still part of a wider financing network, and then building that very long, trusting relationship with those civil society actors. That means that we are trusting their knowledge of their own context and acting as facilitators to amplify that and building a more long-term policy. Otherwise, no policy is going to last and be resilient.
Thanks a lot, Mira. So before we open the questions from the floor, maybe a last question to Hans Martin related to these issue. So what do you think the role of risk and vulnerability assessment is in supporting the vulnerable populations?
Yeah, it is without doubt that policies need to consider the differential vulnerabilities and capabilities of different countries, different regions, sectors, and population groups. So fairness considerations are important. We have considered them considerably in the European climate risk assessment, building in particular also on the great work of the IPCC sixth assessment report there. At the same time, the question how to, let's say, measure vulnerability and risks. I mean, looking at many years also of personal experience, I feel it has been passed like a hot potato between decision makers and scholars, because at first sight it sounds like, and partly it is a scientific question, but it is also, you cannot make such an assessment without deep normative considerations and assumptions. So I would actually warn on building policies only on vulnerability and risk assessment, including UCRA. It's an important element, but it cannot answer deeply normative and political questions. Maybe let me give you an example from a couple of years ago. I happened to come across two global flood risk maps, one by a reinsurance company where rich countries, densely populated regions were shown to have the highest risks, understandably, because that's where the expensive infrastructure is. And another one by humanitarian organizations where poor countries, including rural regions, were kind of the red ones, the ones most at risk, because that's where the lives and livelihoods are most affected by floods. I mean, so they were contrasting results, not because any of them was wrong, they both had a fine methodology, but they looked at different things. And this is understandably considering who did it. Also, when doing such assessments, you have to strike a balance between being reductionistic and being subjective. Reductionistic means looking at individual hazards, individual impacts, individual sectors, and kind of separating climate change from the rest of the world. So you can do a quantitative assessment. But if you look at all the complexities of how things play together, then quantitative models or data can only get you so far. So expert assessment, subjective judgments become more and more important if you try to cover the complexity of the world. So that's another challenge. And of course, those assessments are done to inform policies. And maybe I'll use a last example to illustrate this. If you're looking at the vulnerability to sea level rise of a compact city versus a neighboring rural region, your vulnerability assessment would probably show a higher vulnerability for the rural region because it's just more hard to protect a sparsely populated region than a compact city. But does it mean that all the resources should go there? Probably not. Maybe a sensible policy would be to actually indeed give a large share of the resources for protecting the city, because that's where you get the most results. You can do this with limited resources, protecting a large number of people, but then have additional resources in helping those most at need. Maybe resettlement is needed in the rural region, and that's a fairness consideration. And then also looking at a whole society perspective, allocating additional resources for actually seeing how can a region that is flooded once in a while still provide benefits in terms of ecosystem services, cultural yields, so that the policies need to be much more complex than just a simple vulnerability assessment can do. And if I think let's maybe of three groups where particular action is needed, I would say, of course, start with the most vulnerable, the one who are in a most precarious situation, because any additional stress and risk, such as from climate change, will be hard to deal with them. Then the second group, I would say, is those who face transformative adaptation needs, where it's not just a minor adjustment of business as usual, who need to have new data, new resources, new business models. Here it's not so much the current vulnerability, but kind of the additional need to act that determines the assistance. And of course, we also need to ensure adaptation by those who manage important societal resources that are climate resilient. energy supply, water supply, and so on, so that whatever actions they take is aligned with the wider societal needs. If an electricity company had to shut down their service for 2% of the time, it would only cost them 2% of the revenues in a narrow perspective, which it could probably deal with. But if a modern society was without electricity or water for 1 week a year, it would be a disaster. So here it's not so much about support for their narrow needs, but to align, let's say, the wider societal objective with the business objective. So it might be about regulations, standards, and so on that are needed. I'll finish with this one.
Thanks a lot. So I would like to thank our 4 panelists for all the insights into the challenges and ways of building resilient economies and societies. And maybe we can open, I don't know if Simone wants to
well, maybe. If there are already questions, I would open. Okay, there are. So, Mike is coming.
Thank you very much for this discussion, which was illuminating. Climate change is a threat of biblical proportions that I'm afraid that the majority still of people do not fully perceive. I think that there isn't a single word that you mentioned today I do not agree with. And probably in this room you are preaching to the converted, let's see from the questions. So that's a bit of the issue that I actually wanted to raise. I think we should go back to the fact that it's an imperative that we cut emissions now. And this, I don't know, we should always go back there. This requires redesigning in an integrated way, as you were saying, our industrial processes, and I consider agriculture and industry as well, redesign them fundamentally in an innovative way. This would also require countries coming together in a way that it's impossible at a moment when the geopolitical landscape of the world is redesigning itself with wars and a lot of posturing and a narrative that is going very far away from climate change, as if it was, you know, last season's color. This year we talk about AI at conferences. We do not speak about climate change, that's passé. The threat is not passé, it's still there. So I have 2 questions for you. One is my cynical position. I very much liked the framework that says, the social aspect is the goal, the economy is the means, the environment is the construct. My cynical view is that we need to pretend that the economy is the goal, that there is a gigantic opportunity in a new world with new industrial processes, because that's the only way you will move politicians in and the private sector in that direction. If you look at the current elections, this is the year with the most elections in the world, climate change is even not discussed because it takes away from votes. But we could easily be with the US elections and even the European elections the way that they seem to be going. We could go to governments and policies that come away from climate change. So the first question is, how do we get the private sector and the policymakers to go in the direction that you've been advocating for? And the other one is, how do we support our young people and generations who, you know, I think still a minority of them, despite social media, unfortunately, are very aware of the threat in making a revolution here, in a proactive but effective way. So apologies if I've been long, but these are my two questions for you. Thank you very much.
Would you please also introduce yourself? So
I'm sorry, I'm Gioia Gatesi. I'm the chair of a transport company that only uses renewable energy. Thank you.
Thank you.
Fabrizia, may I suggest that we take the 4 questions that are already on the ground, because time flies.
Yes,
and then we give an opportunity to answer. So
please take notes.
And
Great. Good
short
morning. Edward Coulthorpe from the European Investment Bank. Thank you so much for the panel, and really sort of strong message about the urgent need for greater investment to build resilience, both within the EU, but also in some of the most vulnerable and exposed regions of the world. Quick question really about how you see, you sort of mentioned a little bit about attracting innovative finance, new business models. Clearly we have very limited public budgets. They're going to dwindle. So we have to get the private sector on board. 2 observations our side. I mean, the really good news there is there's an explosion of data, thanks in part to the work of Hans Martin and Shonali and AR6. And so any good corporate now has, there's simply no excuse for not being able to explain to their shareholders and the public at large how they're seeing future climate change affect their supply chains, etc. So that's the good news. The bad news, I think, where we're still struggling, or where we still see problems, there's still this basic lack of a market. You can invest today as a city, but you reduce damage into the future, but there's no monetary revenue flow from it. Yeah? You invest in a floodplain, but there's no revenues that flow from it. There's still this missing market there. So do you see innovation? Do you see business models? Do you see how do we advance on attracting new sources of private finance?
Thank you. I have the 2 gentlemen, actually 2 colleagues on the first row. Okay.
Thank you very much. I'm Takashi Hongo. I work at the Mitsui Global Static Study Institute. This is a private think tank for industry. My question is the science data, science analysis. How to use science analysis? This is my question. For instance, here, Shonali explained that the design of house is important. I think also the design of city, it is really important. I have to touch upon the city planning in Asian and Pacific area to some extent. And a very big surprise for me is city planning, no consideration of the climate risk. However, I work at the private sector, and for instance, Hans explained energy project. As a part of due diligence, so the climate-related analysis is incorporated to some extent, gradually considering and using the scientific analysis. So where in this, for instance, specific area, what kind of change of the weather pattern are there? So for also the possible inundation area, etc. Such kind of analysis is already progressing. But for me, it's a very strange thing is why city planning not using the scientific analysis. So this is a question to UNFCCC colleague, because I think the adaptation plan, you are asking many countries. So I think in part of the adaptation plan, I think it is better to recommend to do a scientific analysis as a kind of due diligence for city planning. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We take the last 2 questions.
All right, maybe, yes. Okay, quick,
Good morning.
please.
I'm Giorgia Caboni. I'm a University of Siena and chair of Prima Foundation involved in promoting and investing on innovation in Euromed agri-food system. So you all referred to the role of the private sector. The private sector is extremely important to gain more sustainability. The good news is that in Europe, at least, the regulation, especially on finance, is having some impact. So we should recognize that there are some changes. what we are learning is that there is an extreme difference between large companies and small, medium-sized companies. So we cannot just talk about the private sector. I mean, there are two completely different worlds, especially in the area of agriculture. So the real task is how to support small, medium-sized enterprises. As you said before, how to make them access to the ecosystem of innovation. I mean, if they are not able to enter the ecosystem of innovation, the battle is lost. So we need to work on this issue. And innovation is not only technological, it's also organizational. We need to support companies in growing, in getting certifications, in getting a new business model. So please, we need to share the two topics. So which is the key word? I think the key word is partnerships. I know that now is not the right time to talk about partnerships, but we need to work on it. Partnership is a key word. For instance, Europe is promoting within the mission land the creation of 100 living labs. We need to work on this to put together different experiences and expertise, and that is the route. I was recently in a meeting preparatory of the next G7, the Italian G7, and there was a top officer of African Union, and he said, we don't need money, we need partnerships, loyal, effective, constructive partnerships. So what is your opinion about and how the European Union could promote more effective partnerships?
And the last question, and then we...
Very last, and then we need to...
Yeah, I'll be very brief, so you have
a couple
5
of
full
minutes.
minutes to
Yes,
answer.
Exactly.
Okay. Now, I've much appreciated the references you made to the global north, global south tension in this transition. But I have the feeling that sometimes there are some issues that are undermined and not fully considered. For example, what I have on the back of my mind is the impact that much needed measures like the carbon border adjustment mechanism can have in terms of rebound effect in the short run on global south. What is your take on this, and what the European Union can do in order to minimize the negative impact of such measure, as I said, much needed measure on the global south?
thank you. So maybe we have 1 minute or so for
we have
each
7 minutes to save the world.
Exactly, exactly. So maybe we can start from, I don't know, Massamba, please.
I'm happy to start. I think all the questions that have been raised are very important questions. Starting with innovation. We need to understand that while science is value neutral, innovation has always an agenda. And the reality is that innovation has been, to a large extent, focusing on supporting power, be it economic power or military power. Now we need to find a way to focus more innovation on supporting the needs of the many people and the needs of the planet. And this is how innovation can be used to attract the private sector into the green economy. We need to have several things. We need to have regulation like financial regulation to push the private sector to invest in green. We need to have policy instruments like internalizing the negative externality, carbon market, putting price on carbon. But we need also to make the innovative solution more attractive so that the private sector is willing to invest there. And it is very important to address the first intervention. If we want to have transformative climate and sustainability action, the starting point cannot be the economy and the industry, for a very simple reason, because if you start from there, you keep the same product, you can only have incremental change. Your focus will be on how can I improve the existing if you start from the needs of the many people without taking for granted that we need to continue to use the same product and services, then you may come up with alternatives that disrupt cement. It's not about improving cement, but bringing a new type of materials. But you can only do that because we want to have everyone on board and nobody being negatively impacted. The solutions that we are proposing should be able to accommodate the repurposing of the skills and knowledge that are present in the current sector that will be disrupted, so that you avoid negative impact on workers. We do not want stranded workers and social failure. It should be also able to accommodate the repurposing of the assets so that we do not have stranded asset and financial failure. Like, for example, if we want to promote hydrogen, green hydrogen, we should be able to accommodate the repurposing of the current gas pipeline so that these assets do not get stranded.
So we have 3 more minutes, maybe 1 minute to Shonali, 1 minute to Hans Martin, and maybe Mira also. Please.
Yeah, so I mean, I think these questions are all very critical questions, the ones that were raised, and I appreciate that this is not an easy thing. But I think a lot of it comes down to this short-termism versus long-term. In many cases, even when we're talking about, okay, making economics the center of our policies at mitigation or reducing emissions and so on, the fact is there is a huge economic opportunity. But this is not going to be realized in the short term. It's going to take time to get to the benefits, to the returns on the investments. And this is something that I think we really need a fundamental change in terms of how we think about policies, about how we think about finance, how we think about implementation. Because the fact is, if we're going to continue in our short-termism way of implementation, where everything is about the next 5 years, about the next vote, then we are not going to get to where we need to get. We will continue to make these little incremental improvements, but we are not going to get to the transformation that we require. So, I mean, this really means fundamentally thinking about how we can de-risk, how we can really convert our immediate short-term cost-benefit thinking into the longer-term outcomes and impacts. Because otherwise, we're leaving the younger generation with having to clean up a mess that they didn't create.
Right. Hans Martin, please.
Yeah, very, very important question. Let me maybe just focus on one or two that are directly related to the work of the European Environment Agency. There was the questions how we can raise the urgency of action. And in UCRA, we've gone further from just assessing the risks to indeed having the urgency to act as the main outcome. A message that I heard repeated again and again is, well, UCRA has assessed 36 major risks for Europe, 21 of them require more action at the European level, and 8 of them require particularly urgent action. I mean, you can say, is it plus, minus, or 1 or 2, but we've gone further from just a risk assessment to looking at the policy context, at the time horizons, the planning context, to say this is actually about urgency, and that is something that resonates a lot with our audience. And maybe to conclude on something positive, for a long time, it was mostly the converted environmental or climate policymakers who followed up on this. Now we've seen a lot of interest from policymakers across the topics: health, industry, security, you name it, central banks. So a wide range of actors understand this is something for them to consider. And maybe finally also partnerships. For a long time I've seen kind of a debate between national and European policymakers. And many countries say, EU, what are you doing around climate risks, adaptation? Adaptation is local, we'll deal with it, thank you. And now they understand that policy frameworks are needed also at the European level, that many countries can't deal with it alone. So there is quite an openness for new partnerships from our perspective.
Right.
Time is up, but I'd like to leave a last word to Mira. You know, this is a kind of metaphor of our mistake. We didn't leave time to the young generation.
And also the burden to the young generation to conclude.
And to be really quick in our actions.
Yes.
I'll touch on the quick question on CBAM. I think, because it's a very valid question, I don't think, though, that the problem is the CBAM itself. It's the lack of the complementary policies. If you're trying to stop drug trafficking, you do put in place policies to stop the buying and selling of drugs because they're part of a harmful ecosystem. So the goods that are supposed to be blocked by the CBAM are part of a harmful production system. You do need the complementary policies to then be financing the small businesses and civil society to give them that alternative, the same way you help the children who've been trafficking drugs because they're from a disadvantaged context in the first place.
Okay,
you, Mira.
I think that was brilliant. Yes.
So I would like to thank you all, and a well-deserved applause to all our panelists, and thank you for participating. See you next time.
Thank you.
Okay. Good day, everyone, and welcome to this panel discussion on building Ukraine back better, here on the second and last day of the State of the Union in Florence. So this panel is supported by the Open Society Foundations, and with my expert panelists, we're going to be discussing the ongoing recovery process in Ukraine and the quite unique engagement of the EU in that effort. So I'm Simone. I am a part-time professor of international relations and conflict studies here at the Robert Schuman Center of the EUI. And for someone whose academic baby steps were made in Kosovo in the early 2000s, at a time of really peak optimism in the international community's capacity to lead comprehensive reconstruction programs, it is hard not to be both fascinated and a bit puzzled at the vigor with which the EU has approached the recovery of Ukraine. Fascinated because it is, all things considered, a remarkably united Europe that has committed to this comprehensive recovery and enlargement effort. But also a little puzzled because comprehensive reform of war-torn countries is now kind of back on the agenda. While globally, really large-scale peace building and state building has mainly been replaced by leaner approaches and transactional partnerships. But also puzzled because of the many contradictions that could, pop up here. Ukraine still has a war to win. Enlargement, upon which this recovery plan now hinges, is a hugely complicated process, full of quite painful challenges. And Europe itself is in a moment of retrospection, possibly. And indeed, the question is, can it take on such a huge task, which, in fairness, is unlikely to see sort of strings of success story, at least in the short and medium term. On the other hand, one can, of course, certainly recognize the importance of getting this as right as possible. The devastation of Ukrainian infrastructure, the heavy toll on the economy, the uprooting and displacement of millions of people, and the challenges of governance in a context of an industrial-scale Russian war of aggression. The recovery process is and will be a Hercules task. But it's also clearly vital, right, in order to prevent the collapse of the Ukrainian society now at war. So this is, I think, exactly the time to engage critically with the process. How can we ensure that the EU does not fall in the many traps, potential traps, of externally led reconstruction? And what kind of Ukraine will emerge from their recovery process? So clearly, we have a lot to unpack in this 1 hour and 50 minutes or so available. And indeed, let me, with pleasure, introduce our expert panelists that will help us doing so. Goran Buldiowski, he's the Managing Director for Europe and Central Asia at the Open Society Foundations. We got Anna Jarosz-Fries, the Director of the Ukraine Service, the DG for Neighborhood and Enlargement Negotiations of the European Commission, and Head of the Secretariat of the Donor Coordination Platform for Ukraine. We have Miriam Kosmal, the Senior Expert for Eastern Europe and European Neighborhood of the Bertelsmann Stiftung. And finally, Aida Hozic, Associate Professor of International Relations at University of Florida. And this panel is going to be perhaps slightly different from some of the others you've been going to this in the State of the Union, because we're going to have 3 rounds where the speakers will respond to the same question, and also perhaps enticing some debate at the panel level. And then we're going to open up for plenty of questions from our esteemed audience. So, to get us started, and we will start from Goran here. Now, the EU's Ukraine facility and the associated disbursement and priority framework that we have now seen released recently, the Ukraine plan, foresee an unprecedented rebuilding of the economy and society of Ukraine. And from your point of view, what are the biggest challenges to supporting the recovery of a country which is still very much at war?
Thank you. Thank you for this opportunity and really to be part of this esteemed panel. So let me start having the privilege of other panelists really marshalling the details of the plan better than I do. Let me just start from a bit of a helicopter view. So, you know, this is an unprecedented instrument for the EU. It's an unprecedented also for the conditions in which it is devised, but also for the problem that it tackles. Still, I believe that there are 2 intertwining challenges that are that could both help, but as well hinder the future of the response. And those intertwined challenges are the ability for the EU to make a joint goal setting. And the second one is to make those goals or to make those decisions not from a position of fear. And let me just very quickly elaborate. The instrument itself actually now really incorporates a lot of things where there is a joint thinking, where there's joint objectives. But in the back of the mind, and in particular, I would say in the back of the mind of politicians who have those decisions to be made, still there is not enough thinking of what does it mean to win a war. Still, for example, in the back of the mind of too many people, the narrative is like, we will support Ukraine as long as it takes, you know, like more or less quoting a quip from a previous crisis, which sounds nice, but what does it mean? And I think this is really important to mean, what does it mean for Europe to win that war? And also the unfavorable question, what's the alternative? And what will be the response of Europe in the alternative? That goes hand in hand with this position of fear. You know, I have to say, all the kudos to civil servants. They respond with the instruments, they respond to the politicians. But like, when are we going to see when EU leaders, especially at the level of the European Council, will sit down and talk about difficult subjects when actually they are not faced with the wall and the crisis situation? And I think this particular issue now necessitates this type of thinking. Yesterday we had a chance to hear from Enrico Letta. He actually presented a report that is not based on fear. But I want to see not only the former Prime Minister and former politician, we need that type of thinking to go into the European Council and those difficult issues to be discussed. And Ukraine, first and foremost, will be probably the top 1 difficult issue on the European agenda for the years to come.
Anna, please.
Thank you. I think Ukraine facility, it's quite a political statement from the European Council. It's 50 billion euro for an external support. It's unprecedented in size. It's unprecedented in terms of when it happened. We have never had a substantive revision of multi-annual financial framework, so the EU long-term budget in the middle of it. And it is unprecedented in terms of how closely it conditions that support to a very clearly set out comprehensive reform program on the one hand, through Ukraine Plan, and on the other hand offers a very large de-risking capacity for public and private investments through Pillar 2, so support to investments, and offers at the same time capacity building, so support to the Ukrainian administration and civil society in order actually to be in the position to implement those reforms. I think this is a political commitment, and it's also a little bit of insurance against future politics. I mean, it's a sunk cost, no? I mean, the moment you pay, you want to recoup something on your investment. I'm an economist, you can surely hear that. But it is not only a technocratic way of getting Ukraine to do a comprehensive reform and policy agenda, which is good for the country, because this is what fundamentally the Ukraine plan is. It's a plan prepared by Ukraine, it's a plan that Ukraine owns, and its success depends on implementation by Ukraine. It's tailored to circumstances of a country at war. So it is the view of the Ukrainian government and also the view of the Commission, but the member states, that it's feasible to implement. You have all sorts of safeguards and flexibilities inbuilt in the instrument in case situation changes, because nobody has the crystal ball, and I very much agree that the implementation of it, which is one of the biggest challenges, will also be conditioned by the situation on the front, which in turn is conditioned by the military support. So the two on the ground very much influence each other. And this is probably one of the biggest challenges in the next years. Thank you.
Thank you. I wish to second what Goran said about the security issues and add that because Russia is fighting successfully a conventional war with nuclear deterrence, that does not only keep military support at bay, but also entails the risk of division within Europe that affects in turn the support Ukraine needs, in addition to, of course, building a European pillar in NATO, which again also affects this war and the European security order generally. Regarding implementation, to me the biggest challenges are demography. I do acknowledge that the EU perspective is very important in that it gives people another reason to stay or to go back, I think, because who wants to live in a gray zone? So this is an important change. This is a door that has opened with the war, rightly so. But we have to acknowledge, hand in hand with the demographic decline, and Ukraine had a demography problem before the large-scale war started, so it just became more grave. But together with this, we have very weak administrative capacity. I was in Kiev last in February, March, and I was told that a ministry, I don't know what your information is, that has only a 30% shortage of staff is considered to be a lucky ministry. And being in Chernihiv, this is the oblast that borders Russia and Belarus, if you look at the local administrations, particularly in regions that are close to the contact line, to the fighting, there is a lack of people. So on the one hand, you have an admirable engagement, motivation of those there. On the other hand, they really have problems to make ends meet. And together with this last sentence, salaries. There is the Agency for Restoration, and you, in the regions, I heard you have people with a monthly salary of 300, 400 US dollars, in the future having to handle funding, much larger funding. So this, of course, also entails risks. Maybe I stop here.
Okay, thank you. Aida.
Thank you, Simone, for the introductions. And I just want to take a moment also to thank everybody at EUI and the Schumann Center for hosting us here, and particularly to kind of the tireless staff that's working in the background over these 2 days. I'll be very single focused, I think, in my remarks today. And so I want to highlight how crucial actually gender dimensions of this war are, and how crucial women are for any possible recovery of Ukraine, and then possibly of Europe as well. So I want to say that, just to kind of preface this by saying that I'm very doubtful that the war is going to end, or insecurities in Ukraine are going to end anytime soon. Ukraine is not going to change its geography, it's going to stay where it is. And Russia's regime is not going to fall. Even if Putin goes, there's a very strong security apparatus now in place in the very militarized country that's just not going to go away. And we have to reckon with that. On the gender dimensions of this war, it's a very unevenly distributed war in terms of who carries what kind of burden. As we know, it's mostly men who are in the front, in the trenches, wounded, maimed. And so Ukraine has this tremendous need for more manly bodies who can actually go and sacrifice their lives on the front. At the same time, women have greater freedom of movement, but they are also carrying the burden of sustaining that war effort through whether paid or unpaid work. And they are also disproportionately, in comparison to other European countries, actually represented in the Ukrainian military. So they're very crucial for the security aspects of the situation in Ukraine. Then, continuing on what Miriam said, they're crucial for demography. Ukraine has really experienced a precipitous decline, both in its fertility rates and in its population. It's down 20 million people since 1990s, and it's projected to lose another 10 million people in the next decade. And as we know, children don't get produced through immaculate conception. They are made by women and raised by women and cared by women. So women's bodies are crucial for that demographic stability, if not growth and reversal. And then the third aspect of this kind of centrality of women to Ukraine at the moment is that remittances represent between 7 and 10% of GDP in Ukraine. They are about 2 times the size of foreign direct investment at this point in Ukraine. They are twice the size of the agricultural export from Ukraine. So Ukraine is really integrated in the European economy, again, through the flow of bodies and people who are working elsewhere. And those are primarily women who work in the care industries in Europe. And so these 3 components, security, demography, and remittances, integration in the European economy, often work at cross purposes with each other. And I think that needs to be kind of, again, taken into account and reckoned with more forcefully and more clearly in any of the future recovery plans.
Thank you very much. These are all really strong points kicking off this discussion. We indeed have challenges, numerous challenges at various levels within Europe, in Ukraine, and of course it is a unique, possibly really unique situation. So thank you all for that. Now the second question concerns and looking at this at a slightly sort of longer perspective, looking at and considering some of the risks or traps, let's say. And indeed a significant percentage of the Ukraine 50 billion euro are earmarked positive conditionality on EU enlargement-related reforms. And the question is how you believe that the advantages and, please, the disadvantages with combining a sort of recovery post-war. We are not there, but this is how we have prior, the way we have conceptualized it prior, post-war recovery, with EU integration. And is there, in your view, any kind of key takeaways that can be learned from past experiences with such twin processes, namely in the Western Balkans? Anna, will you like to go first?
Thank you. Maybe let me explain how the policy conditionality on the implementation of the Ukraine plan and until that kicks in terms of payments, the 6 billion euros that were already paid to Ukraine in March and April in 2 tranches against the kind of lighter conditionality of the bridge financing, how that policy conditionality was discussed and negotiated with Ukraine, through which lens, and how this relates to the enlargement process. When you look at the needs of Ukraine for the next 4 years, they need to grow. I think all the challenges that my panelists mentioned are there. Demography, so labor is one of the biggest in this, how women will be able to help carry the economy forward are one of the key elements. But what the country needs, they need to grow. And they need to grow and invest in a way that with every donors and Ukrainians' money spent or invested in Ukraine, they do it thinking that this brings them closer to the path towards being ready for accession. Then when you look at our acquis, I mean, some of it generates costs. Some of it is very business friendly. So a selection and prioritization was made in order to see what is it that Ukraine needs to do in what sequence in the next 4 years to get to a comprehensive economic strategy that allows transformation of the country and conditions for growth. So you have the macro-financial stability pillar, which is indispensable. You need to have inflation under control, right? You need to have macro-financial stability. You have a business environment pillar, which is massive because it goes through the fundamentals. It goes through anti-corruption, through the judiciary reform, through the reform of the prosecution reform, through the bailiff system, through the court enforcement orders, through from very high level to nitty-gritty in terms of the conditions for functioning in the country, for operating as a business, but also for functioning as a citizen in terms of rule of law that you then break down into lots of very concrete steps. Then you have a whole block of human capital, from the reform of the labor law to reform of the vocational education and training. Skills are one of the biggest problems going forward in the recovery in terms of a mismatch, what is there and what is needed. Looking at possibly at migration, looking at housing, looking at early childhood care in order to integrate, to allow women to be in the labor market, having a strategy for veterans, etc., etc. These are massive challenges that will not be answered in the next 4 years, but at least there is a basis for looking at them comprehensively. And then you have the whole pillar of where do we think we will grow, i.e. where does Ukraine think they'll grow, and which sectors have either the industrial base already or a market in the Union or a potential for export in order to generate jobs, but also to generate revenue that Ukraine needs in order to get just progressively less dependent on external assistance. And then these reforms, when implemented, they will make a tick in the enlargement process as well, because they are, again, a subset of the union law. It's a subset. The enlargement negotiations are significantly wider the obligations stemming from this process in terms of legislation and implementation are larger, but Ukraine has agreed with us this prioritization to which money is attached. And I think that is the essence of the approach that the Union is taking towards supporting Ukraine in its massive challenges that they have to deal with, starting the recovery and being in a position to progress on the accession path.
Miriam?
I agree that the Ukraine plan is a great strategic approach and for the first time probably such a comprehensive endeavor. I have some doubts that it will work as straightforward as you describe, not only but also because we are in the midst of war still, and for the economy and for productivity to take off. The potential is there, I absolutely agree, but the problem is that we, in a war of attrition, will not have the economic reliability that is needed for new investors to come. And for now, you have the situation that the old investors stay, but you don't have new ones coming in. And I do not really see that changing. Second, and this is the major pillar in terms of finances, it's the private money that Ukraine needs for this to take off. We mentioned the weak capacity. If I understand it correctly, there is for now the amount of 4 billion for capacity building at all levels, national down to the local. If you compare this to IPA funding for other countries, that's not a lot for such a huge country as Ukraine, and the capacities are as weak as we just discussed. Another challenge is governance. We do have in Ukraine a very successful reform, decentralization reform, that for the first time since 2014 established multi-level governance successfully because it went hand in hand with fiscal decentralization. Not only because of a recent political reshuffle, we do see a tendency to re-centralize. Some of it is very justified because this is, in certain respects, a logical situation in times of war. At the same time, this multi-level governance to function is also crucial for regional development and to deal with these imbalances that the war has also engraved. So I do think there a lot of, but you mentioned it, flexibility is needed to respond to the changes that are taking place constantly.
I will now take the helicopter position that Goran took in the first round of questions and continue on the kind of discussions that were held already yesterday at the panel on enlargement in the Western Balkans and Ukraine as well. I think that actually this is the best thing about the plan, is that it combines accession and disbursement, and that it's actually kind of putting conditionalities in place so that Ukraine, one way or the other, is already on that path. I think what we have learned over the last decade is that being a part of EU does not necessarily prove countries from democratic backsliding. But we have also learned that delaying their accession, thinking that they should be fully democratic before they accede, is not helpful either. And so if you're faced with that kind of a choice, I think European embrace is much better option than keeping countries on ice and actually kind of making that accession ever less likely because of the long and extended period of wait. And so regardless of the wars are also opportunities. You can push reforms, which you probably can't in other times. And I think Ukraine is tremendously motivated to become a part of European Union. And so this may be actually a chance to do these painful reforms, which otherwise, would face more resistance. So I really think that this, in that sense, the combination of these two tools is excellent.
Thank you.
Yeah. I'm rarely a fan of Tina. There is no alternative. But on this, I really have to say there is no alternative but combining these two processes. And actually, now they're also technocratically and technically well combined, and they're clear on both sides. Now, colleagues spoke a lot about Ukraine and its own. Let's turn the other side of the equation. Let's look at the EU. And I want to share one lesson from the Western Balkans accession process. Let's not forget that from summer 2013 until summer 2022, and thanks to the war, the accession process was dead, or if you want a politically correct term, moribund. But it was not there. And it was not there not only because of a non-performance of the member states, it was not there because of bilateral blockages, it was not there because of revised methodology, it was not there because of unclosed and unopened chapters of negotiations, and many things which on the EU side were not there. And what's the result? The result is now actually when I look at the EU, I see a critical mass for the accession, but when I look at the Western Balkans, that critical mass is gone. You have literally two countries that want to accede, and they're doing kind of with a lukewarm effort, Montenegro and Albania. There was a third one that now chose a new government, North Macedonia, and we'll see how that will happen. And there is one that clearly demonstrates with its own acts that wants more not to accede than to accede, Serbia, and actually wants to pursue a foreign policy of some kind of desired equidistance with other global powers. And I think that's really important to see and learn a lesson. Why? Because if you have a prolonged period of disillusionment and disappointment in the process, it's very logical that political leaders in that place will look for alternatives. And unfortunately, the authoritarian alternative, when you look to some kind of a, since I come from former Yugoslavia, let me say that, a post-Tito approach of equidistance, not because I like it, but it sounds funny, but politicians believe. And at this moment it's unthinkable, but it could be a plausible narrative and a plausible political platform in the future. So I really would warn on the side of the European Union to be not only careful, but really to make sure that there is no major disillusionment at political level. And given the instruments where actually a country, one of my favorite in the Union, like Hungary, where I used to live for a long time, can block this every few months, or other conversations, these are the things that one really has to be careful about. And I think EU will, when I talk about thinking more strategic, I also think as well how to move beyond those daily political issues that could not only beset the process, but actually disillusion the Ukrainian very motivated counterpart.
Thank you very much for these responses. And indeed, experiences are very important, not just as a basis for lessons learned, but how they shape behavior really, and how the European Union is fronting and approaching the Ukraine. So here I'm going to connect just a final question to some of the more general global challenges, because of course a lot of this debate is quite localized in our neck of the woods. But of course we got this is not happening in a vacuum. So I want to ask you a little bit about some of these kind of global 2024 challenges that do feature in the Ukraine plan. But I want to hear your kind of views on the challenges related to it. Environmental concerns, gender equality, and indeed we have heard that already, and digitalization. Now, in your these kind of cross-cutting themes and issues, right? So I want to ask your view on how about their relative importance in this ongoing recovery process. Miriam, would you like to get us started?
Crucially important because Ukraine is integrating into a fundamentally different EU than, for example, Croatia. And the good news is that Ukraine has potential exactly where it is advantageous for the EU in terms of economic security. green energy. There are even cases of green steel production, digitization, engineering, machinery. So the potential is there to contribute. So it's not only global food security where Ukraine could be an asset, but the fundamentally different situation I also see, and I'm sorry, I have to again return to security. In the Western Balkans, NATO was present since the 1990s, and Croatia was a NATO member before it entered the EU. And Croatia didn't have a neighbor with nuclear weapons. So I still think we cannot dream of the necessary investment coming in before we solve the security issues. And the lack of proper air defense is one such issue that is solvable, and that would, in my view, be a prerequisite for investment coming in.
Aida.
I think Ukraine is incredibly important. We touched upon that in the pre-panel discussions last night, because it's big, because it's huge, because it's sitting on the border of the large nuclear power, sandwiched between Europe and Russia, and also because it sets a precedent for future possible recoveries, reconstructions elsewhere. I think Ukraine also comes after nearly 3 decades of disastrous liberal interventions and liberal peace. And there's a lot to be learned from, a lot of not necessarily positive lessons to be learned from Iraq, from Afghanistan, from Western Balkans, from Rwanda, that we should not repeat in Ukraine. And so I think there is a possibility there to actually either completely fail for Europe or to rebuild itself through Ukraine in a very different way.
I think first and foremost, it's important that the Ukraine facility document and the whole plan factors in this. So it's inside, it's incorporated. I mean, different experts may argue could have been better, more or less, and so on, but it's there. So actually that already provides a very solid basis on the policy level. But I want to single out one thing, which is not so much about the substance, but the process and the mode in which we engage now on the policy level. And this is actually I find it as the biggest challenge, and that's still the short-termism with which this is assessed. And we will go into very much of an implementation. I think the plan is there is a vision, and if all goes well, I have no doubt this will be well implemented. But when I look at the future European Councils and how this will happen, again, we will be kept sort of hostages in terms of short-term thinking. And this is where actually I fail to see this flurry of policy change. Europe has not been short of policy change, but actually it doesn't translate in something which is a consistent strategy. And I know you have to incorporate Trojan horses like Hungary. I know you have to actually, some countries, some member states will have to forego some of their interests. But unless this is done, and I don't see, and in that case, this is not only important just for Ukraine, it's important about the future of European Union. I think we have enough thinking. I mentioned earlier Enrico Letta. Richard Youngs promotes in his latest book something which is called geoliberalism. I think the ideas are out there, but how from the level of ideas you will translate to a political decision in the European Council, I don't think that there is not only magic wand, but also the critical sense of urgency. And I think at the moment also not only about the short-termism, it's a critical sense of urgency that this is almost equally as important for the European Union as it is for Ukraine.
Thank you very much. Just wanted to say that before I give Anna the last 2 minutes for this round, to the audience to prepare your questions as we will go to the Q&A afterwards. Please, Anna.
Oh, thank you. So the elements that you mentioned, digitalization, gender, environmental issues in particular, and through the policy conditionality in the Ukraine plan, they're kind of mainstream. There are also some hard requirements. So the facility, for example, requires, so the regulation requires that 20% of the investments under Pillar 2 and Pillar 1 combined are supposed to contribute to climate change, environmental protection, etc., taking into account the conditions of a country at war. I think these are the tools that we have. They might sound very bureaucratic, but this is how you actually implement it. In terms of conditions for the investments, I think there's nothing coming in terms of massive amounts until we have a clarity of the security situation. But we are going to sign, and we have kind of approved already in April, equivalent of 1.4 billion euros of guarantee contracts with international financial institutions for investments in Ukraine to be implemented in the next year and a half. And that's with the expected leverage ratio of about 4. So it requires de-risking by the public. So here the risk is on the union budget. But it is happening. So we have to start, right, with bringing those private investors that are sufficiently have sufficiently risk appetite to do this, but in particular start with the public investments that will create the conditions from housing to roads in order for further investments eventually to come in. I mean, the implementation challenges are massive. I think all the issues that my panelists mentioned are very, very true. But we have no alternative, as Goran said, that to try to make the best out of it and adjust as we go.
Okay, thank you very much for these insightful points on the challenges related to these cross-cutting themes and this kind of opportunity somehow as well to get things right, as much as possible. Now we want to open up for questions from our indeed esteemed and eager audience. So we will have someone with the microphone around. Maybe we might take a couple of questions late in the middle.
Hello, my name is Milena Mihajlovic, European Policy Center, Belgrade. I was wondering if anybody on the panel would like to comment on the ongoing discussions to use the Russian foreign reserves for rebuilding of Ukraine, the pros and cons, and just a comment on that.
Thank you very much. Anyone else would like to add? Please, Oksana.
Thank you. I'm Oksana Antonenko. I'm visiting fellow at the Schumann Center. I guess the key question, very much referring to what Goran was talking about at the very beginning of this session, is what messages are we giving now to the Ukrainian people? And I think this message about support Ukraine for as long as it takes, I mean, I think it's good in itself, but it's not very motivating for the population, which is exhausted by the war. And I think we need to think about how to redefine this message to support as long as it takes, but to achieve a victory as soon as possible, because the people are exhausted. And I think the message that this war will continue for a very long time is very demotivating and actually leading to many people choosing to leave the country. And then the second, I guess my question in relations to that, we do need to have a very clear definition of victory, because ultimately that's what we're aiming for. And I think that's what Goran referred to at the end, not to do it from the perspective of fear. And I think I want to ask the panel, what is your view about what is the key priority for that? And of course, it is for Ukrainian people to decide, and President Zelensky was very clear about that. But are we shifting now from the discussion about recovery of territories to the 1991 borders to actually prioritizing the idea of the viable Ukrainian state which can integrate with the European Union as soon as possible? Or are we still in a situation where we think that we first have to achieve full integration and then talk about the viability? I think this is the key issue which needs to be answered, because that's very much is going to define how the priorities will be shaped in relations to reconstruction.
Thank you. The final question this round in the very back.
Olena Sneger, Schumann Center. It's not a question, it's rather a comment. I would agree with what Oksana has said about this message, demotivating message, and need for some positive vision of future. And I would add that here is what is needed is vision of EU policy towards Russia and how to win this war, and not just to resist and support Ukraine and to delegate Ukraine the mission of containing the main aggressor on the European continent.
Thank you very much. Now, would you like to pick up on these questions? Goran, would you be okay with perhaps starting? You can pick one or several.
Yeah, I will go with the second one. I don't know much about the Russian assets, but the question of defining a victory, that's also a very, very hard question. But, you know, it's a question that nobody can afford not to answer. And even if it has ABCs, you know, people at this side of, you know, in European Union have been developing scenarios, but it's not only about developing scenarios, it's actually then putting all these financial frameworks and then running them through those scenarios. And not only that, then also combining it with a message. I mean, even it doesn't take a war. When you look at the Western Balkans, if you have the ability to walk in with your feet and go and establish your life in the European Union, many people simply checked out. They decided to accede in the European Union individually, not as a country. And that's what's happening. That's what, and in Ukraine it has happened already on a mass scale and could happen even with other waves. I mean, this is what Aida was referring to. And I think that's important not only as analytical thinking, but it's also, it has to have a very strong human dimension. And on that, given that we work quite a lot with civil society, I think, you know, Ukrainian civil society has been amazing in supporting the efforts and being really supportive. And I think we should not forget that as the difficulties go on, and there will be many difficulties in implementation with corruption and everything, the civil society in Ukraine will have to remain in its position to criticize without being called a fifth column or enemies of the state because we're in the war and whatnot. And that's not easy when you're under pressure. But equally, I would say the civil society at the European side has to move from the sense of solidarity or the sense of think tanks doing analysis into actually what is more. Because I believe that those messages are not only when Macron says in Sorbonne, I think those messages should come at the micro level. It's not only the remittances, it's also that one should send messages in Ukraine by multiple channels, by different people, by associations. You know, imagine if agricultural unions can send a message to their peers in Ukraine. Unthinkable at the moment. Actually, they're protesting about something else. But these are the things where I believe we have an untapped resource of messaging. Because otherwise, it's inevitable that if not all, at least some people, and at this moment every single Ukrainian counts, will choose their individual path to the European Union.
Anna, would you like to have
I'd like to address the question on Russian frozen assets, but before I do, I just pick up on when you left it, just to say that European Dairy Association on the 9th of May has signed a cooperation agreement with an association of Ukrainian dairies. So some of that is happening already. So the proceeds from Russian frozen assets. So actually, the Union is well, the jurisdiction that holds the most of and the bulk of the Russian frozen assets from the Russian central bank. In terms of the private assets, these are small globally compared to the amounts that are frozen in terms of central bank assets. The Council has just approved a Council decision, so-called Step 2, towards using the proceeds of the assets, which are central bank assets, which are mobilized within the Union, to the benefit of Ukraine. And it has, there is, an implementation which is in the process, for the central depository that holds these assets to transfer them to the union budget. The Council has also decided on the distribution of this year's proceeds for the different needs. And 90% will be used to support the military equipment, and in particular the ammunition, and 10% will be channeled to Ukraine facility. This is literally a decision of, I think, earlier this week. And then the implementation will follow probably in the course of the summer. Then the Council has the opportunity to review the destination and the distribution as of 1st of January next year. But this is a very concrete and a fairly immediate transfer that will happen to the benefit of Ukraine.
Thank you. Mira.
Then maybe I pick up on the question, what does it mean to win? Somebody said it, it's up to the Ukrainians. There is the Ukrainian peace plan. It's going to be discussed in Switzerland in June. And still the problem is, or the issue, that there will not be a majority in NATO in the foreseeable future. There is second best with the bilateral security agreements. And maybe if you have coalitions of the willing within these, having already concluded or in the process of concluding the agreements, you will have a more effective support. But it is very difficult in Ukraine to explain the way Ukraine has handled responsibly the support, why you will have been following the discussion yourself. It is such an issue whether Ukraine can use the weapons to strike logistics within Russia. There are some, the UK, who have clearly said, we do support this, everything else is not realistic. The US, after Minister Blinken has been in Kiev, is going for the same approach. It is no coincidence that after the UK minister said it first, there was in the southern military district of Russia, exercise with tactical nuclear weapons as a sign to the European public. That's what I mean when I say that Russia's deterrence works. So I'm afraid I do not have the response to your rightly critical question.
Thank you. Aida, you would like to add something?
I will address the peace issue also, because I think it's, once again, it is really the question that has been daunting everyone since the beginning of the Russian invasion. And it's also one that I have found many people are reluctant to address at all. In part because I think it's been implied very often that, once again, that peace and victory would mean the defeat of Russia. And I think also most people understand that that is, as I had indicated before, that may be an unrealistic expectation. And so therefore, we end up in this kind of situation of suspense, which is the hardest, obviously, for Ukrainians themselves. Again, from the very unpleasant helicopter position, because I have been in that position where other people were deciding about my future and my kind of existence. I think that some of this depends on how we interpret Putin's regime and Russia's intentions. I think that Putin may be less likely, from my interpretation, may be less likely to go ahead and kind of take over Ukraine and then continue and proceed by taking over other parts of Europe, simply because I think they would understand what the cost of that control would entail. But on the other hand, Russia has proven over the last 2 decades, again observing this from Western Balkans primarily, it has proven itself very capable of exploiting every possible weakness and every possible sovereignty issue to its advantage. And so I have no doubt that if Ukraine remains divided, that eastern territory will be a constant and perpetual sort of contention. So, you know, from my perspective, the ideal solution would be to retrieve those territories, to go back to the previous border of Ukraine and to have, obviously, Ukraine independent and free, rather than divided for Russia to continue to exploit that division for decades and decades to come. But how realistic that is, I really don't know.
Thank you very much. Additional questions from the audience? We are happy to take them. In the middle, please.
Thank you very much. My name is Bartosz. I represent the Warsaw School of Economics. I have a very direct and open question to all of you. How do you see the future EU-Russia relations taking into account the direct and indirect dependency of Ukraine to Russia, as well as the scale of Kremlin infiltration into the Ukrainian political system, business sector, and economical system, to the security and energetic aspect. And whatever the scenario will follow, and in whichever scenario the war will end, assuming that the Ukraine will join the European Union. Thank you.
Thank you. Please, there in the middle as well.
Hi, my name is Yibeke from CMI Matatsari Peace Foundation. Since we've gone into some of the controversial questions, let me go ahead and ask another one then. I think that there's one aspect maybe that could also be a challenge down the line, which is that prior to the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, there were a lot of social cohesion challenges in Ukraine. There's been substantial EU support provided for peace building in the country for quite some time. And there's a very sophisticated network of mediators throughout the country working on these issues continuously also now, often under the umbrella of resilience. Nonetheless, these are challenges that remain. The EU has started some small investments through the FPI in focusing on the liberated territories when it comes to peace-building needs. But where does this figure then in the plan? Are these things that are taken into account once the Russian invasion is over? Is this something that might resurface? How might that be complicated? And also some political tensions that are growing with the leadership in the country at a national level where elections are pushed forward and so forth. Could this have a destabilizing factor inside the country once the war is over? And how is that taken into account in the overall building back better of Ukraine? Thanks.
Okay, final question from the audience for this round. There, yeah.
Hi, thank you. Thank you so much for the wonderful panel. In part, Jelena Jankic, Robert Schuman Center. In part, following up on what Goran has said, and what we've heard now about when the war is over. The war has been ongoing for 2 years and 3 months exactly on this day. And I don't see it ending tomorrow or in 2 months. So wars last for years. And the longer they last, the greater the need for post-conflict reconstruction in terms of investments, as we've heard, in terms of physical buildings, etc., but also in terms of the human trauma. So the more time elapses, the more difficult will it be to deal with the issues of displacement, etc., but above all of societal trauma. So I was wondering whether the panel could address the issue of how do you see Ukraine and Ukrainian people essentially rebuilding the society, this human trust, and it's kind of how to move forward as a cohesive society. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jelena. Any final question? And I think then we're going to close this part. Okay, very okay. Front row, please.
Yes, thanks. My name is Joseph Ingram, and I'm a former director of the World Bank office in Bosnia and Herzegovina. from 2000 to 2003. And as Ida was suggesting, there are plenty of lessons from other post-conflict countries which should be absorbed and taken into account. The whole question of security, however, and I think it was Goran who mentioned, in Bosnia, of course, you had the Peace Implementation Council, and they created an international force, the stabilization force, made up of military from various countries to, quote, keep the peace while the physical reconstruction was taking place. And I'm wondering if in the case of Ukraine, you've talked about, Anna, the European Commission, the European Union, are you in discussion, the European Union, with the United Nations, with the US government, with the Canadian government, other governments which have a stake in the future of Ukraine, in discussion with them to examine what kind of support, military, police, would be provided, could be provided by the international community, it's important, in the case of Ukraine? Or is it just the European countries that are thinking about this? And are you thinking of something along the same lines?
Okay.
To provide that sense of security.
Thank you very much, Joe, for that. Well, so you get precisely 1 minute each. You can, and we're going to Russian-EU relations, peace mediation, traumas, and international coordination. Please pick one, and that will be concluding our panel. Ida, would you like to?
I will actually respond to the first question, though I would love to respond to Yelena's question about trauma, because yes, wars last actually for decades, even after they are over. But I would respond to the first question by saying two things, I think. One is, I think we have to keep in mind that Ukraine is already in Europe. So we should not I mean, it may not be a member of the European Union, but it is already a European country. And so I think that in terms of relations between European Union and Russia, if Ukraine were to become a part of European Union, I don't think that that should fundamentally change the relationships between European Union and Russia, if that makes any sense. The border of the European Union would shift, but it's not as if Ukraine would all of a sudden become something that it's not already, or that that border would become something that it's not already, even from the Russian perspective. If I'm to be hopeful for a moment, it would be that actually moving that border to Russia would increase the chances of Russia being a part of Europe as well. If I'm not to be hopeful, then it would be more about European Union at this point, which does have to rethink its security arrangements in ways it was not forced to do before, ever since the end of World War II. And the costs that sudden need for militarization and thinking about security very differently than it had before might have on its own visions of democracy internally. So that would be, my fears are greater for what's going to happen to Europe itself than what would be the prospect of European and Russian relations in case Ukraine becomes a member of European Union.
Social cohesion, excellent question. I think many Ukrainians are very much aware. It will be a topic at the upcoming recovery conference and connected to the demand, the clear demand of Ukrainian society to be involved on a permanent basis in the implementation of the Ukraine plan. Trade-offs you will always have. I do see a challenge there, of course, in the decision-making at the different levels, national, regional, local. But again, this is something that people monitor and insist to be an active part in. And you have many examples where Ukrainian society, with this large-scale war, is more decisive, more clear. Another example from the anti-corruption field, when there was the question about reopening officials' asset declarations, there was a there was a referendum, and within it was a matter within hours where you had over 80,000 votes collected, and only 25,000 were necessary for the presidential recognition. Elections, I do not see that as a realistic demand right now because of the war situation, and this is how, and this is more important than how I see it, how the majority of Ukrainians see it. Trust, very important. I think it was indicative that immediately after the large-scale war, that goes together with what I said about being decisive of where people want to go, to not tolerate going backwards, to be very reform-oriented. The only issue is, and this is my last sentence, that there is a gap between those, or this is how I sense it, a gap between those staying in Ukraine or having gone back and those not yet having gone back or maybe never going back. So there is a tendency that this polarizes, yes.
Thank you. Goran, would you like to go?
Yeah, let me go first with the social cohesion question. And first and foremost, this should not be waited until the war is over. Because, you know, we heard about the position of women. It could only get worse. We know from other war-torn regions that it's not easy afterwards. Second, Open Society Foundation, for example, has been working on the issue of Roma. I think the discrimination of Roma in Ukraine has stopped. No, it hasn't, unfortunately. Minorities. We don't need Hungary just to raise the Hungarian minority. That's also an issue. These are issues that actually have to be dealt, and I think instruments as the ones that we have now help. Now, probably we have to also calibrate the expectations, and then those expectations should be also brought in tandem with what kind of political process Ukraine can have internally without having elections. Which means, you know, the fact that you don't have elections doesn't mean that you should not have a pluralistic opinion. It doesn't mean that you should not have an open debate and voice different opinions, even if the decision is made from a center. But it's really important because if this starts happening, I think it's important that there is a space for debate, even if there are no elections. And that should be upheld as a value because Ukraine actually is a country, it has it. On the other question on Russia, it pains me that European Union yet another time is disrupted, not a disruptor. And I think first and foremost one has to start thinking where the European Union can be disruptor. And I think that with the sanctions was a first very clear concerted effort, but it's not sufficient. I think that has to be built in. We're now talking very comprehensively about how we protect ourselves from the disruption of others, maybe belatedly, but what about disruption to others? And I think that has to be, and that has to be an even playing field. And just a last thought, when you talk about talking, it's not only to talk to US and Canada, probably with them you talk and collaborate and do things together, but the channels European Union opens also with countries like India, like China, many others, we just woke up to a new world where the rest of the world did not sideline with the European Union and Ukraine in the wake of the war, and we were surprised. But as we can see that engagement slowly and surely starts giving some dividends, and that's not something for tomorrow. And again I repeat, sometimes we should not be only with the economic interests or only with we are here coming to promote peace. Maybe a mindset of being disruptor also to their interests may yield benefits to the European Union.
Thank you. Final words, Hanna Jarosz, please.
Just two remarks. One, in terms of having a political process and a functioning democracy despite lack of elections, I invite everybody to read Article 5 of Ukraine Facility Regulation. It's a precondition that we need to assess at every payment, and it's incredibly important that democratic political process continues to function in Ukraine, covering civil society, media, all of that, despite the fact that there is a martial law in place. International cooperation, we have a very close donor coordination in the G7 plus format. I think for the first time it's kind of structured, including an administrative structure. So for more than a year now, there is a multi-agency donor coordination platform for Ukraine that has expanded in terms of membership. So basically, it's a very, by now, a very large table of like-minded donors that coordinate very closely on economic support. But of course, it's also an opportunity for Ukraine to address donors at the same time. And you have, other fora, Rammstein is the military support coordination. We have a very, specific ones on coordination for supporting the energy sector, etc. So there is a very close work together with like-minded countries and a number of them.
Okay, now with that, I want to thank you, our audience, both here in person in the Teatro, at the Badia here in Florence, and online. And above all, thank you very much to our distinguished speaker for your truly insightful and frank comments on this important process of rebuilding Ukraine. For sure, this is not the last time we will have these conversations, and I look forward to next time. And with that, this panel comes to an end. Thank you.